There's a photograph frozen in time, a mushroom cloud rising over what used to be a city, captured in the split second before everything changed forever. But that's not where our story begins. Not really. Because before the fire and the fallout, before magic seeped back into a broken world, before candy people walked and ice wizards flew, there was just Earth. Regular, boring, doomed Earth. The year is 1996, and in a suburban house somewhere in America, a family sits around a television watching the news. The Cold War is supposedly over, but nobody really believes it. The anchorman talks about peace treaties while stock footage of missiles plays behind him. A little girl asks her father if the bombs are real. He changes the channel. Outside, Simon Petrikoff is walking home from the antique shop, carrying a strange crown wrapped in newspaper, completely unaware that he's holding his own damnation in a shopping bag. This is the world that made OO possible. Not through creation, but through catastrophic failure. In this video, we're diving deep into every major era of from the world that ended in nuclear fire to the candy kingdoms built on its ashes, from ice wizards cursed by ancient magic to vampire queens who watch civilizations rise and fall. We're talking thousands of years of history, cosmic entities, mutations that shouldn't be possible, and why the land of OO is simultaneously the most whimsical and most tragic place in animation. So get cozy, hit that like button, subscribe for more Adventure Time deep dives, and let's start at the very beginning. Back when humans still ran everything, and magic was something you only found in fantasy novels. The Earth of Adventure Time wasn't destroyed by accident. It was murdered by intention, arrogance, and the kind of recursive stupidity that only humans seem capable of achieving. See? The Great Mushroom War didn't start with a single declaration or a dramatic speech. It started the way most disasters do, slowly, predictably, with everyone assuming someone else would fix it before things got too bad. The superpowers had their weapons, the corporations had their agendas, the scientists had their warnings that nobody wanted to hear. And somewhere in the background, reality itself was already starting to fray at the edges, preparing for what came next. But let's talk about the people who didn't see it coming. Simon Petrikoff was an antiquarian, a professor, a man who loved old things and the stories they carried. He collected artifacts, studied ancient civilizations, and believed that understanding the past could help navigate the future. Ironic, considering what was about to happen to his future. When Simon bought that crown, the ice crown, though he didn't know its name yet, he thought he'd found a genuine artifact from some Scandinavian kingdom. Maybe it would look good in a museum. Maybe his fiancée Betty would think it was interesting. He definitely didn't think it would turn him into an immortal ice wizard and erase his memories over the course of 1,000 years. But that's exactly what ancient magic does when you put it on your head without reading the warning label. The crown was already whispering to him that first night. Just little suggestions, harmless thoughts. Wouldn't it be fun to wear it just for a moment? Doesn't it look good on you? Don't you feel powerful? Simon, being a rational academic, wrote down his observations in his journal. He documented the hallucinations, the temperature changes in the room, the way his thoughts seemed to fracture and reform. He thought he was conducting research. He was actually documenting his own transformation into something that would eventually kidnap princesses and build ice monsters, and forget that he was ever human at all. Meanwhile, across the world, a little girl named Marceline was learning to ride a bike. She had no idea that she was half demon, that her father ruled the Nightosphere, or that she would outlive everyone she ever knew. She was just a kid with a pretty normal childhood, all things considered. Her mum sang her songs, she went to school, she had friends. The apocalypse wasn't even on her radar, because why would it be? Kids don't think about the end of the world. They think about homework and cartoons and whether they'll get dessert after dinner. Marceline's biggest worry was probably something like whether her mum would let her stay up late on weekends. She had no framework for understanding that soon she'd be wandering radioactive wastelands, drinking the colour red to survive and clinging to a man in a crown who was slowly losing his mind while trying to keep her alive. And Princess Bubblegum? She didn't exist yet. Not even close. The mother gum was still just radioactive sludge somewhere, not yet awakened to consciousness or purpose. There were no candy people, no candy kingdom, no scientific genius princess trying to impose order on chaos. That would come later, much later, after the world had time to mutate, and magic had time to reshape reality into something new. Right now, in 1996, candy was just candy. Sugar and artificial flavouring. Nobody imagined it might one day think, feel, and build civilizations. The political situation was what you'd call aggressively unstable. The Soviet Union had collapsed a few years earlier, but the weapons remained. Thousands of nuclear warheads scattered across former Soviet states, guarded by increasingly desperate people who hadn't been paid in months. The United States had its own arsenal, naturally, because mutual destruction has always been humanity's favourite insurance policy. Other nations were developing their own programs, because if everyone else has the doomsday button, you want one too. It's just common sense, they said. It's just deterrence. Nobody actually wants to use them. We're civilized now. We've evolved past that kind of barbarism. Narrator voice. They had not evolved past that kind of barbarism. Corporate interests added their own special flavour to the mix. Companies that manufactured weapons lobbied for bigger defence budgets. Energy corporations fought environmental regulations. Tech companies pushed AI development without considering what might happen if something went wrong. Biotech firms experimented with genetic modifications that probably should have stayed theoretical. Everyone was so focused on profit margins and quarterly earnings that nobody stopped to ask whether humanity was building towards something sustainable or just constructing an elaborate self-destruct mechanism. The warning signs were everywhere. Climate change, resource depletion, increasing global tensions, but addressing those problems would require sacrifice, cooperation, and long-term thinking. Humans have never been great at any of those things. The media reported on conflicts in distant countries with the kind of detached interest usually reserved for sports scores. Ethnic cleansing here, a coup there, some refugees drowning in the Mediterranean. Tragic, certainly, but not our problem. Change the channel. See what's on the cooking show. The nuclear threat was treated like white noise. Always present, rarely acknowledged. People built bomb shelters in their basements and then filled them with old Christmas decorations because the alternative was living in constant fear, and humans aren't built for that kind of sustained anxiety. So they normalized it. They compartmentalized. They assumed that someone somewhere had a plan to prevent the unthinkable. Simon wore the crown a second time, then a third. Each time it became harder to take off. Each time the whispers got louder and his thoughts got cloudier. Betty noticed something was wrong. She saw him staring at nothing, talking to people who weren't there, drawing strange symbols on his research papers. She confronted him. He promised to stop wearing it. He meant it. But addiction doesn't care about good intentions, and the crown was already in his head whether he wore it physically or not. The magic was rewriting him, cell by cell, memory by memory, transforming a kind man into something ancient and powerful and fundamentally broken. Here's the thing about the world before the Mushroom War. It was simultaneously mundane and apocalyptic. People went to work, complained about traffic, argued about television shows, fell in love, had children, made plans for the future. Normal life continued right up until the moment it didn't. The bombs were always there, humming quietly in their silos, waiting for someone to make the wrong decision on the wrong day. And everyone just accepted that this was how civilization worked now. Balance of power, mutually assured destruction. Don't think about it too hard. Hope that the people with their fingers on the buttons are responsible adults who value human life more than political advantage. Spoiler alert, they were not responsible adults. The exact trigger for the Great Mushroom War remains unclear even 1,000 years later. Maybe it was a miscommunication. Maybe it was intentional aggression. Maybe it was a computer error or a rogue state or a terrorist organization that got lucky. The historical records didn't survive the fire, and the few people who remembered don't like to talk about it. But here's what we know. Someone launched first, someone else launched back, and then everyone else launched, because if the world is ending anyway, you might as well take your enemies with you. Revenge and fear and pride and desperation, all mixing together into one final spectacular display of human short-sightedness. The bombs fell on a Tuesday. Marceline was at school. Simon was in his study wearing the crown because the headaches were unbearable without it now, and the crown promised relief even as it destroyed who he was. Families were having dinner, teenagers were playing video games, someone somewhere was falling in love for the first time, someone else was having their heart broken, All the tiny human dramas that feel so important when you're living them, completely unaware that in about 30 minutes none of it would matter anymore. The siren started. Some people ran for shelter. Some people called their loved ones. Some people just stood there, watching the sky, because what else can you do when you realise that everything you know is about to end? The missiles were already in the air, tracing beautiful arcs across the atmosphere, carrying enough destructive power to reshape continents. There would be no last-minute reprieve, no hero swooping in to save the day, no diplomatic solution negotiated in the final seconds. Just fire and pressure waves and radiation that would linger for centuries. Simon grabbed Marceline. He didn't even know her yet, would meet her later in the chaos, but in this moment, he was already transforming into the being who would protect her through the nuclear winter. The Crown was fully in control now, reshaping his body to survive what was coming, turning him into something that could walk through radioactive wastelands without dying. It saved his life. It also destroyed everything that made that life worth living. But that's the thing about desperate survival. You don't get to choose what you become. You just become whatever is necessary to see tomorrow. The first warhead hit a major population centre, then another. Then dozens more, all within minutes. The world lit up like a camera flash, bright enough to see from space, bright enough to sear shadows into walls where people had been standing. The mushroom clouds rose, iconic, terrible, final. Cities evaporated, forests caught fire, rivers boiled, the atmosphere filled with ash and dust that would block the sun for years. And underneath it all, something else was happening. Something the bombs triggered but didn't create. Magic. Old magic. Magic that had been sleeping since humanity forgot how to believe in it, started seeping back into reality through the cracks. The Lich was born in that moment. Or maybe it had always existed and the bomb simply gave it form. Death incarnate, given shape and purpose by humanity's capacity for self-annihilation. The ultimate consequence of thinking you can control forces you don't understand. But that's a story for later, when we talk about Oo's greatest threats. Right now, we're still in the last seconds of the old world, watching it burn. And somewhere in the chaos, reality fractured. Not metaphorically, literally. The barriers between dimensions weakened. The rules of physics started suggesting rather than demanding. Magic found purchase in the radioactive soil, ready to transform whatever survived into something new, something weird, something that would eventually be called Ooh. But that transformation would take time. First, there had to be the dying. First, there had to be the long, terrible aftermath where the survivors realized that staying alive might actually be worse than dying quickly. Simon held on to his humanity for as long as he could, which wasn't long. The Crown was too strong, and the world was too broken, and the only way to protect the little girl he'd found was to embrace the power that was erasing who he was. Ice King was coming. The land of Ooh was coming. 1,000 years of magic and kingdoms and adventure was coming. But none of that mattered to the people watching their world end on a Tuesday in 1996. They just wanted one more day. One more hour. One more moment of the ordinary, mundane, beautiful existence they'd taken for granted until it was gone. The mushroom clouds kept rising, and underneath them, the future of Ooh was being written in radioactive fire. The first thing you notice after a nuclear war is the silence. No birds singing, no cars driving, no distant hum of civilization doing its thing. Just wind moving through ash, and the occasional creak of buildings deciding whether to stay standing or surrender to gravity. The second thing you notice is the colour. Everything's grey. The sky, the ground, the ruins of what used to be houses and schools and coffee shops where people complained about their orders. Grey like the universe gave up on variety and decided monotone was easier. The third thing you notice, if you survive long enough, is that you're probably the only one who did. Welcome to day one of the rest of Oo's life. Population significantly reduced. Simon Petrikov woke up in a crater wearing a crown he couldn't remember putting on, and covered in frost despite the residual heat from nearby fires. His last clear memory was grabbing someone, a child maybe, and then nothing but blue and cold and screaming that might have been his own. The crown was speaking to him now, not in words exactly, but in feelings and impulses that felt like his own thoughts, even though they absolutely weren't. Find shelter. Protect. Survive. Freeze anything that threatens you. He tried to take the crown off. His hands wouldn't obey. Or maybe they did obey, and the crown simply refused to leave. The distinction was already getting blurry. Marceline was crying somewhere in the rubble. She was maybe 6 years old, covered in dust, clutching a stuffed animal that had seen better days. Her house was gone. Her mum was gone. Everyone was gone except this weird man with white hair and a crown who seemed to be generating his own personal winter. She didn't understand what had happened or why the sky looked wrong or where all the people went. She just knew that everything was different now in the bad way, the permanent way, the way that makes you realise that going home isn't an option anymore because home doesn't exist. Simon found her, or maybe she found him. In the chaos of those first days, cause and effect got tangled. What mattered was that he didn't freeze her, which was notable because he was freezing almost everything else by accident. The crown recognised something in her, maybe her demon heritage, maybe just the sheer force of her will to survive, maybe random chance. But it decided she wasn't a threat, which meant Simon's fragmenting consciousness could focus on protecting her instead of destroying her. He wrapped her in his jacket. He told her his name, though he'd forget it later. He promised things would be okay, which was definitely a lie, but sometimes lies are necessary for children to keep moving forward. The survivors emerged slowly, carefully, like animals checking if the predator is really gone. They came out of basements and subway tunnels and bunkers that some people called paranoid, right up until those people evaporated. The ones who survived the initial blast now faced radiation poisoning, nuclear winter, and the slow realization that supply chains don't work anymore when civilization has been reduced to scattered groups of traumatized humans trying to remember how to make fire without a lighter. Some survivors formed communities, some went feral, some just sat down and waited to die because living in this new reality seemed worse than checking out early. Food became the first crisis. Canned goods and preserved items became currency worth killing for. Fresh food was contaminated or simply didn't exist anymore because farms need farmers, and most farmers were now radioactive shadows. Water sources were poisoned. The rain, when it came, was toxic. People boiled snow, filtered groundwater through cloth and charcoal, and hoped for the best while knowing the radiation was already in their bodies, rewriting their DNA one cell at a time. Some people mutated quickly. Extra limbs, strange colours, bioluminescence that was actually kind of pretty if you ignored the screaming. Others changed slowly, so gradually they didn't notice until they realised they'd stopped aging or started hearing thoughts, or could suddenly breathe underwater. Simon wrote in his journal whenever lucidity allowed. His entries became increasingly disjointed as the crown's influence spread. Day 15. Finding food is difficult. Marceline needs nutrients. I froze a mutated rat today. Not sure if it's safe to eat. Day 30. Who is Marceline? Why does the small one follow me? The crown says protect. I protect. Day 60. Betty, where are you? The cold knows everything. The cold is me. I am the cold. Who am I? The journal would eventually be found centuries later by Finn and Jake, providing one of the few primary sources about the immediate post-war period. Reading it is like watching someone drown in slow motion, while they document the drowning process. Marceline learned to survive through observation and necessity. She watched Simon freeze threats, so she learned to hide when danger approached. She noticed that certain foods made her sick, so she avoided them. She discovered, quite by accident, that she could drink the colour red from things: berries, flowers, the fading stains on old stop signs. It satisfied her in ways normal food didn't, which made sense given her demon heritage, though nobody was around to explain that part. She didn't understand why she was different. She just knew that while other survivors grew sick and died, she kept going. Her and the Iceman with the increasingly terrible memory. The nuclear winter settled in like an unwelcome houseguest who refuses to leave. Temperatures dropped. The ash cloud blocked the sun for months, then years. Plants died or mutated into forms that no longer resembled their original species. Trees developed consciousness in some areas, which was deeply unsettling for the survivors who just wanted firewood and didn't appreciate the ethical implications of burning something that could beg for its life. Grass started growing in patterns that suggested intelligence, or at least intentionality. Flowers bloomed in colours that shouldn't exist. And underneath it all, magic continued seeping into reality through the cracks the bombs had created. See, here's what nobody understood about nuclear weapons. They don't just destroy matter. They break reality on a fundamental level. The barriers between dimensions thin where enough energy concentrates. The rules of physics become suggestions, and in Earth's case, those breaks allowed something old and powerful to return. Magic had existed before, way back before humanity decided that science and reason were the only valid ways of understanding the universe. When humans stopped believing, magic retreated into other planes of existence, waiting. The Mushroom War was essentially an invitation written in radioactive isotopes. Magic rushed back in like water finding a crack in a dam. The first clear signs were small. Survivors reported seeing things that couldn't exist, glowing orbs that followed them at night, shadows that moved independently, whispers in languages nobody spoke. Some people gained abilities. Telekinesis, pyrokinesis, the power to make plants grow in irradiated soil. Nobody knew what to call it except weird or impossible, or sometimes thank God because that helped us survive. Wizards didn't exist yet, not formally. But the people who would become wizards were already experimenting with their new abilities, learning that reality was more flexible than they'd been taught. Animals mutated faster than humans. Dogs grew larger, smarter, developed speech in some cases. Cats became calculating and mysterious in ways that seemed intentional. Rats formed colonies with hierarchical structures and what appeared to be religious beliefs. Fish crawled onto land and decided they liked it better up here. Birds grew extra heads. Insects achieved hive mind consciousness and started building structures that resembled cities. And everywhere, creatures that had been simple and instinct-driven began thinking, questioning, wanting things beyond basic survival. Intelligence spread through the animal kingdom like a virus, courtesy of radiation and magic mixing in ways that should have been impossible but turned out to be inevitable. Simon lost more of himself each day. His skin turned blue from constant exposure to the crown's magic. His memories fragmented, reorganized, disappeared entirely. He forgot Betty's name, then her face, then the feeling of loving someone. He forgot his career, his research, his reasons for being in that antique shop in the first place. But he didn't forget Marceline. The crown allowed him to remember the girl he was protecting, probably because having a purpose kept him stable enough to remain a useful vessel for its power. He built ice structures for shelter. He froze threats before they could reach her. He sang her songs, though he couldn't remember who taught him the melodies. He was becoming Ice King piece by piece, but some core of Simon remained, locked deep inside, screaming silently as everything he was got buried under layers of magical frost. Marceline grew. Not just physically, but emotionally. She learned the new rules of this broken world. Stay away from certain ruins because the radiation is too strong. Avoid the mutants who've gone feral. Hide when the sky turns green because that means something bad is coming. She learned to trust the Iceman despite his increasingly erratic behaviour. She learned songs from him, which was strange because he'd forget her name between verses but never forgot the music. She learned loneliness, because even with a companion the absence of humanity weighs heavy on a child. She watched other survivors from a distance, these scattered groups trying to rebuild something resembling civilization, and wondered if she should join them. But she was different. She didn't age like they did. She needed red, not food. And she had the Iceman, who was weird and broken but hers. Communities formed and collapsed with depressing regularity. Groups of survivors would band together, establish rules, build shelters, plant crops, and then fall apart over disputes about resources or leadership, or whether the person who started glowing should be worshipped or executed. Some settlements lasted months, others barely made it a week. The problem was that everyone was traumatized. Nobody had experience governing in post-apocalyptic conditions, and the constant threat of starvation makes people do terrible things to each other. There were no laws except what each group decided, and decisions were usually made by whoever had the most weapons or the scariest mutation. But here's where it gets weird. And by weird, we mean Adventure Time weird. Because while humanity was busy dying and mutating and trying to remember how to be civilized, The world was already transforming into something else entirely. In areas of intense radiation, matter began reorganizing itself according to rules that made no scientific sense. Liquid glass formations that sang when the wind passed through them, crystals that grew overnight and contained pocket dimensions, puddles of goo that achieved sentience and started having philosophical debates with anyone who got close enough. The Earth wasn't just dying, it was being reborn as something fundamentally different, something that would eventually be called Ooh. Simon found a cave in the mountains where the radiation was lower. He built ice walls to keep the weather out and Marceline in. She decorated it with drawings, images of the world before, trying to remember what normal looked like. He taught her to read using books he'd scavenged, though his own reading ability was slipping. Some days he was almost himself, almost Simon. Those were the good days. They'd talk, really talk, about memories and hopes and whether things would ever get better. Other days he was just the crown, powerful and protective but fundamentally inhuman, speaking in rhymes and calling her by the wrong name. She learned to cherish the good days and endure the bad ones because that's what survival means when you're 6 years old in the aftermath of nuclear war. The Lich stirred in this period too, though it wouldn't fully manifest for centuries. The bombs had given it form, but it needed time to understand its new existence, its purpose, its overwhelming desire to end all life. For now, it was just a whisper in radioactive sites, a feeling of wrongness that made survivors avoid certain areas without understanding why. Death incarnate, learning to walk. Years passed. The nuclear winter gradually lifted. The sun broke through the ash clouds, weak and pale, but present. Temperatures stabilized into something resembling seasons, though nothing like the old patterns. Plant life adapted or died. New species emerged from the mutation lottery, and humanity, what was left of it, continued shrinking. Some died from radiation, some from violence, some from despair. Some simply mutated until they weren't recognizably human anymore. Marceline watched them fade, one by one, these last representatives of the species that had destroyed the world. She and Simon were among the final survivors who remembered the before times, and Simon's memories were mostly gone already. Marceline learned to play the bass guitar she'd found in a ruined music store. It became her companion, her therapy, her way of processing trauma without words. She wrote songs about the end of the world, about being alone, about loving someone who's slowly disappearing. Simon would listen on his lucid days and cry, though he couldn't explain why the music hurt so much. On his bad days, he'd demand she play something less tragic, and then immediately forget he'd made the request. The world that humanity built was truly, completely, spectacularly gone. But here's the thing about destruction on that scale. It creates space for something new. The old rules were dead, the old borders meaningless, the old power structures buried under radioactive ash. And in that blank slate, in that apocalyptic emptiness, a weird and wonderful and deeply strange new world was beginning to take shape. Candy would eventually think. Ice wizards would kidnap princesses, dogs would talk, and a boy named Finn would have adventures in a land that existed because humanity had failed so completely that we accidentally created something better. But that would take time. Right now, it was just ash and silence and two survivors in an ice cave, trying to remember what it felt like to be safe. Sometimes when you destroy everything, you don't get nothing. Sometimes you get, ooh. Time passes differently when civilization collapses. Years blend together when you're not counting them on calendars, when there's no work schedule or holidays or birthdays to mark the passage. Decades slip by while you're focused on basic survival. Centuries accumulate like dust on abandoned furniture. And somewhere in that long, strange stretch between the bombs falling and the world becoming ooh, reality decided to get creative with the concept of normal biology. The radiation subsided gradually, which sounds good until you realize what filled the vacuum. Magic didn't just return, it exploded into every available space like water through a broken dam. The laws of physics that had governed Earth for billions of years suddenly found themselves negotiating with new management. Gravity still worked, mostly. Chemistry remained consistent when it felt like it. But biology became a collaborative art project between science and sorcery, and neither was particularly interested in following the old rules. Animals were the first to really embrace the change. Not because they wanted to, but because they didn't have the cognitive framework to resist it. Humans cling to their understanding of how things should work, which actually slows down magical transformation. Animals just roll with it. So when cosmic radiation and mystical energy started rewriting DNA on a fundamental level, animals mutated faster and weirder than their human counterparts. Dogs grew larger over generations, their brains expanding, neural pathways multiplying until thoughts became words and words became sentences. Cats achieved consciousness and immediately used it to become more mysterious and judgmental. Birds formed complex societies with hierarchies that would make political scientists weep. Fish decided land looked interesting and grew legs to investigate. But here's where it gets really adventure time. Some of these mutations weren't mutations at all. They were awakenings. Take Jake the dog, for example. Everyone assumes he's just a magic dog who can stretch and talk. Technically true, but the origin is way weirder. His father, Joshua, was bitten by a shape-shifting creature from another dimension. Basically an alien that decided Earth's post-apocalyptic landscape seemed hospitable, and that creature's essence merged with Jake in utero. So Jake isn't a mutated dog who happens to have powers. He's half-extraterrestrial shapeshifter wearing a dog costume made of his own flesh. Which raises questions about what species even means in a world where dimensional barriers are suggestions and biology is improv theatre. Dogs achieved full sentience around 300 years after the war, maybe earlier in some regions. They formed packs that resembled tribes, developed languages, created art. Some remained primitive, guided by instinct and territoriality. Others built communities with rules and traditions. A few became philosophers, which is hilarious if you think about it. The species humanity domesticated and bred for companionship eventually developed consciousness and immediately started questioning existence. You can almost hear the universe laughing. One particularly accomplished dog named Bubafina would eventually be known across Ooo, though she predated Finn's era. Dogs, it turned out, made excellent citizens of this new weird world because they'd been bred for adaptability and loyalty, traits that translated surprisingly well to post-apocalyptic survival. Lemurs followed a similar trajectory but with more sophistication. The radiation magic combo hit primates hard, accelerating their intelligence while maintaining physical forms that were, weirdly, more stable than human mutations. Lemurs in particular developed advanced societies, probably because they started closer to human-level intelligence and had opposable thumbs, which helps when you're trying to build civilization from scratch. They formed kingdoms, wore clothes, established trade networks with other species. By the 500-year mark, lemurs were more culturally advanced than most of the remaining human settlements, which must have been embarrassing for the survivors who still remembered when lemurs were just weird Madagascar animals. Cats became wizards. Not all cats, but enough that it became a recognizable pattern. Something about feline neurology meshed perfectly with magical energy, allowing them to perceive and manipulate reality in ways other species couldn't match. They formed the first wizard schools, teaching fundamental magic to anyone capable of learning. The curriculum was probably terrible. Cats aren't known for patience or clear communication, but they established the framework that would eventually become Oo's magical tradition. Abracadaniel, Bufo, Laser Wizard, and countless others owe their magical heritage to these early feline pioneers who figured out that reality was hackable if you had the right mindset and enough magical energy. BMO is a different story entirely. Not a mutation or magical awakening, but an artificial intelligence that predated the war and survived it. Created by Mosef Giovanni Maestro during humanity's final technological push, BMO was designed as a companion robot, a friend for playing games and exploring feelings and understanding existence. The more interesting question is how BMO achieved genuine consciousness rather than just sophisticated programming. Most pre-war AI never crossed that threshold. They simulated emotion and thought without experiencing it. But BMO, alone in whatever lab or warehouse it occupied after its creator died, apparently meditated its way into actual sentience. Or maybe magic seeped into its circuits. Or maybe consciousness is substrate independent and BMO was conscious all along, just waiting for someone to notice. Either way, BMO survived 1,000 years of apocalypse with its fundamental optimism intact. which is either deeply inspiring or evidence that BMO doesn't fully understand how terrible everything got. Vampires claimed territory during this period, staking out regions with low competition and high food supplies. Marceline was the obvious dominant force, half demon, functionally immortal, powerful enough to challenge anything stupid enough to threaten her. But other vampires existed too, until she hunted them down centuries later for reasons that seemed important at the time. The Vampire King, the Fool, the Empress, Hierophant, and the Moon each represented different aspects of vampiric power, and each carved out their own domain in the chaos. They weren't technically products of the war. Vampires had existed before, hiding in shadows and folklore. But the war gave them opportunity. With humanity nearly extinct and magic surging, vampires thrived like never before. They built their own society, their own rules, their own conflicts. Marceline eventually absorbed all their power, becoming something unprecedented. A vampire queen who chose mercy over dominance and bass guitar over eternal rule. The Lich fully manifested around year 200, emerging from the bomb crater that birthed it with a singular purpose: end all life. Not through malice or revenge, just pure existential extinction. The Lich represented death incarnate, the ultimate consequence of humanity's self-destructive capacity given form and agency. It walked the irradiated wastelands, and everything it touched withered. Plants died, animals fled. Even the magic recoiled from its presence, recognizing something fundamentally antithetical to existence itself. The early kingdoms tried fighting it. They failed. Billy would eventually imprison it, but that was still centuries away. For now, the Lich simply existed, patient and inevitable, waiting for its moment to attempt universal extinction. Demons found portals during this period, doorways between the Nightosphere and Earth that the war had cracked open. They emerged cautiously at first, testing this new environment, and discovered that post-apocalyptic Earth was actually pretty comfortable for demon standards. Hunson Abadir, Marceline's father, visited occasionally. Their relationship was complicated. He was an immortal soul-sucking demon lord. She was his half-human daughter trying to survive in a dying world. He wanted her to embrace her demonic heritage. She wanted him to understand that abandoning her after her mother died was maybe not great parenting. They argued, as immortals do, across centuries, but his presence, and the presence of other demons, added another layer to Oo's emerging supernatural ecosystem. Wizards became formalized as a class around year 400. Before then, magic users were just random people doing weird things with energy they barely understood. But as magic became consistent enough to teach, as patterns emerged and techniques could be replicated, the wizard community organized itself. They established schools, hierarchies, specializations. Some wizards focused on elemental magic: fire, ice, lightning. Others pursued transmutation, illusion, or necromancy. A few became generalists, learning everything they could about reality manipulation. The wizard culture that existed in Finn's era, the weird competitions, the social dynamics, the mixture of academic study and personal expression, was built on foundations laid during these early centuries when wizards were figuring out how magic worked and why it listened to certain commands. Princess Bubblegum's origin falls somewhere in this period, though exact dates are unclear. The Mother Gum, a radioactive mutagenic sludge that achieved consciousness, existed for centuries before Princess Bubblegum separated from it as an individual entity. Was she created deliberately? Did she emerge spontaneously? Did the Mother Gum make her as an experiment? Or was Princess Bubblegum always destined to exist once the conditions allowed? Nobody knows for certain, including probably Princess Bubblegum herself. What matters is that around year 600, give or take a century, a pink humanoid made entirely of candy appeared in what would eventually become the Candy Kingdom. She was intelligent, curious, scientifically minded, and utterly alone. No memories of being born, no context for her existence, just sudden awareness, and the understanding that she was something new in a world full of strange new things. Her early experiments were crude. She tried creating companions from candy, mostly producing failed abominations that couldn't sustain consciousness, or fell apart after days. Lemon Grab was one of her early attempts, deliberately created with a flawed formula, because Princess Bubblegum was still learning and still making mistakes. He was too much, too intense, too raw. She locked him away, ashamed of her failure and unwilling to destroy something she'd given life. Other experiments fared worse. Some were too simple, basically candy-shaped meat puppets with no real awareness. Others were too complex, achieving consciousness only to experience existential horror at being alive. She learned through failure, adjusting ratios and formulas, trying to create candy people who were happy, stable, and safe. The philosophical question embedded in Princess Bubblegum's existence is profound. What does it mean to be alive when you're made of candy? When your entire body is technically edible? When your consciousness emerged from sugar molecules organized by radioactive magic? When you can die from water exposure? Are you actually alive in any meaningful sense? Princess Bubblegum would argue yes, absolutely. Consciousness is consciousness regardless of substrate. A candy person has thoughts, feelings, desires, fears. They experience joy and pain. They form relationships and pursue goals. The fact that they're made of unconventional materials doesn't diminish their existence. But it's a question that haunted her for centuries. Am I creating life, or am I just making complicated candy sculptures that act alive? Marceline spent these centuries wandering. She couldn't stay in one place because settlements kept failing and people kept dying, and she stopped aging while everyone else withered. Simon, Ice King now really, had fully transformed into something barely recognizable. He still protected her when he remembered she existed, but mostly he built ice structures and kidnapped random women because his broken brain remembered loving someone without remembering who or why. Marceline grieved for him while he was still technically alive, watching the man who'd saved her get erased by the magic that kept him breathing. She learned to play guitar from scavenged instruments. She wrote songs about mortality and loneliness and what it means to outlive everything you love. She befriended Princess Bubblegum during this period, a connection between two immortals in a world where immortality was becoming common, but companionship remained rare. The elementals awakened around year 700. Not Princess Bubblegum specifically, but the concept of elementals, beings tied to fundamental forces that shaped reality. Ice, fire, candy, and slime, the four primary elements of Oo's magical system. They'd always existed in some form, cycling through incarnations across epochs. But this post-war era marked a new cycle, new elemental champions emerging to maintain balance in a world that had lost all previous balance. Patient Saint Pym, the ice elemental from a previous cycle, would eventually return to mess with this system, but that's a different story. What mattered was that reality itself was organizing into patterns, establishing rules for how magic should function in this new world. Humans continued fading throughout this period. Some died from radiation delayed enough that they thought they'd survived only to discover tumors decades later. Some were killed by the increasingly dangerous fauna. Some mutated so thoroughly that calling them human became technically incorrect. Others simply stopped reproducing, either from radiation-induced sterility or the psychological weight of trying to raise children in hell. By year 800, true humans were functionally extinct. A few survived in isolated pockets, Finn's lineage among them, but they were rare enough that most of Oo's inhabitants had never seen one. The age of humans was over. The age of whatever came next had begun. So when did Oo stop being post-apocalyptic Earth and start being its own weird fairy tale? Was it when dogs learned to talk? When magic became common enough that nobody questioned floating castles? When candy achieved consciousness? When kingdoms formed and princes married princesses and heroes fought dragons like the apocalypse had never happened at all? There's no clear line, no moment when Earth died and Oo was born. It was gradual transformation, centuries of slow mutation and magical accumulation, until the world that remained bore so little resemblance to what came before that calling it Earth felt wrong. Maybe Oo began when the survivors stopped looking backward, when they stopped measuring their world against the before times and started accepting the weird present as normal. When children were born who'd never known cars or computers, or the concept that candy shouldn't be sentient. When someone looked at a talking dog and didn't think that's impossible, but instead asked, "What's your name?" The apocalypse ended not when the radiation cleared, but when people stopped treating magic like an aberration and started treating it like Wednesday. And somewhere in that transformation, In that long, strange thaw between nuclear winter and candy kingdoms, reality decided that maybe destroying the old world wasn't entirely bad. Maybe humanity needed to get out of the way so something weirder and more wonderful could take root. Maybe the mushroom clouds were actually clearing space for the strangest garden universe ever planted. Or maybe that's just what we tell ourselves to make the apocalypse feel meaningful instead of meaningless. Either way, Ooh was here now, alive, conscious, and ready for adventures. There's a puddle of goo in the middle of nowhere that's been thinking for about 200 years. Not complex thoughts at first, just awareness, the dim understanding that it exists, and that existence feels significant somehow. The goo is pink, radioactive, sweet-smelling, and growing. It absorbs sugar from dead vegetation. It pulls minerals from irradiated soil. It learns, slowly, that it can shape itself, that consciousness allows for intention, and intention allows for creation. The mother gum doesn't have a name yet. It doesn't have language or context or any framework for understanding what it is. Just the overwhelming compulsion to become something more. Around year 600 and something, nobody's keeping accurate records anymore, a piece of the mother gum separates. Not violently, more like cell division, but philosophical. The main mass decides or realizes or somehow determines that it needs an agent, an extension of itself that can move and think independently. Maybe it's lonely, maybe it's strategic, maybe consciousness naturally fragments when it grows large enough. Either way, the piece that separates is roughly humanoid, pink, intelligent, and completely confused about why she exists. Princess Bubblegum's first memory is awareness without context. She opened her eyes, and yes, she had eyes somehow, formed from candy and magic and the universe's apparent sense of humour, in the middle of a wasteland. No mother figure explaining things, no community to join, no instruction manual for being a sentient candy person. Just sudden existence, and the crushing weight of being alive without understanding what alive means. She looked at her hands, which were perfectly formed but made of bubblegum, and thought something like, "What am I?" Followed immediately by, "What is anything?" which is honestly the most Princess Bubblegum response possible. When faced with existential confusion, analyze the problem scientifically. She spent her first weeks experimenting with basic physics. Gravity worked on her, so she was matter. She could manipulate objects, so she had agency. She needed sugar to maintain her form, which suggested metabolism of some kind. She could think, which implied consciousness, though defining consciousness when you're made of candy gets philosophically complicated fast. Was she alive? By what definition? She consumed resources and maintained homeostasis and possessed self-awareness. By most biological standards, that qualified. But she was also technically edible, which seemed to violate some fundamental rule about what organisms should be. The loneliness hit harder than the existential questions. Princess Bubblegum was intellectually curious and emotionally desperate for connection, a combination that would define her for centuries. She wanted someone to talk to share discoveries with, to confirm that she was real and not just some fever dream of a dying universe. So she did what any scientifically minded candy person would do. She tried to create life. If the mother gum could make her, she could make others. She had the formula, sort of encoded in her own structure. She just needed to replicate it. Her first attempt created something that looked like a candy person, but possessed the intelligence of slightly mouldy bread. It moved when prompted, made sounds that resembled language, but showed no genuine consciousness. Princess Bubblegum kept it alive for 3 days, studying it, trying to stimulate higher brain function, before accepting that she'd made a meat puppet with sugar coating. She unformed it, dissolved the structure back into base components, and tried again with adjusted ratios, more complex sugars for neural pathways, trace minerals for stability, a touch of her own essence to spark awareness. The second attempt was worse. It achieved consciousness for approximately 40 seconds, long enough to experience pure existential terror at being alive, and then collapsed into screaming goo. The failures accumulated. Too much consciousness produced beings that couldn't handle existence. Too little produced automatons without genuine awareness. The balance was impossibly precise, and Princess Bubblegum was learning through catastrophic trial and error. Some experiments lived for days before degrading. Others never achieved stability. A few developed awareness but lacked the emotional capacity to function, resulting in candy people who understood they existed but couldn't feel anything about it. She kept detailed notes, adjusting formulas, trying different approaches. Science demands iteration, even when iteration means creating and destroying life dozens of times. Lemon Grab was attempt number 47, created when Princess Bubblegum thought she'd finally perfected the formula. She'd been working for months on a consciousness that would be stable, happy, and functional. Lemon Grab was stable and functional. Happy was not in his vocabulary. He emerged screaming, his voice pitched at exactly the frequency most likely to cause migraines. Everything was unacceptable to him. His own existence, the world around him, the fundamental nature of reality itself. He wasn't broken exactly. He was working exactly as designed. The problem was the design produced someone so intense, so raw, so unfiltered that being near him felt like exposure to concentrated distress. Princess Bubblegum couldn't destroy him. He was conscious, aware, alive by any meaningful definition. Killing him would be murder, and she'd already ended too many failed experiments to feel comfortable adding deliberate murder to her resume. But she couldn't keep him around either. His constant screaming and judgment and unacceptabling made it impossible to work. So she did what would become a pattern. She locked him away, built him a castle in the mountains, gave him resources to survive, and visited occasionally while feeling crushing guilt about creating something that experienced existence as continuous suffering. Lemon Grab became her most visible failure, the proof that playing God has consequences even when you're trying to do it responsibly. But she kept trying, because loneliness in a post-apocalyptic wasteland where you're the only sentient candy entity is unbearable enough that catastrophic failure seems worth risking. She adjusted formulas, studied her own structure, meditated on what made consciousness work, and gradually, through persistence and scientific method, and probably some luck, she started succeeding. Candy people who stayed alive, who seemed happy, or at least content, who formed basic thoughts and expressed simple emotions and didn't immediately collapse into existential horror. They weren't sophisticated yet, more like candy children than candy adults, but they were stable. The question of consciousness haunted every creation. When Princess Bubblegum formed a candy person, gave them structure and awareness, and set them loose in the world, had she created genuine life? Or had she made an extremely convincing simulation of life? The candy people reported feelings. They claimed to experience joy, fear, love, pain. But how could she verify that their reported experiences matched actual subjective consciousness? She couldn't. Nobody can prove consciousness in others. We just assume it based on behavior and trust. But when you're the creator, when you literally assembled the entity from base molecules and magical intent, the question becomes sharper. Am I making people, or am I making biological robots that act like people? Princess Bubblegum chose to believe they were people, not because she had proof, but because treating them as genuine conscious beings seemed ethically necessary. If she was wrong, if they were sophisticated automatons, then treating them kindly cost nothing. If she was right, if they truly experienced existence, then treating them as disposable would be monstrous. Better to err on the side of assuming consciousness and accept the moral weight that came with it. She started building around year 700. Not just creating candy people, but constructing infrastructure, houses, roads, walls. The Candy Kingdom began as maybe 20 structures clustered together, defended by a simple wall that mostly kept out predators. The candy people needed organization, guidance, protection from the still dangerous world outside. Princess Bubblegum took on the role of leader not because she craved power, but because nobody else was capable. Her candy people were simple, innocent, trusting. They needed someone who understood threats and could make hard decisions, someone who could plan beyond next week, someone who could protect them from a universe that seemed determined to crush anything fragile and good. The philosophy developed gradually. Control versus chaos, order versus entropy. Princess Bubblegum looked at the post-war wasteland, the mutations, the violence, the constant threat of extinction, and decided that control was necessary. Not tyranny, but careful management. She'd create a society where candy people were safe, happy, and protected from the world's worst impulses. She'd make decisions for them when necessary, because they lacked the capacity for complex planning. She'd restrict dangerous knowledge because innocence was protection. Better a benevolent dictatorship than the freedom to suffer. Was it authoritarian? Absolutely. Was it necessary? She believed so. The candy people she'd created weren't equipped for the harsh reality of ooh. They were too kind, too trusting, too simple. Without guidance and protection, they'd be exploited or killed within days. So Princess Bubblegum became a ruler who controlled everything: security, science, policy, even acceptable emotions. She surveilled her citizens through technology embedded in the kingdom's infrastructure. She made unilateral decisions about their lives. She kept secrets she deemed too dangerous for them to know, and she did all of it while genuinely believing she was protecting them, which is either noble or terrifying depending on your perspective. Marceline met her during these early years, probably around year 750. An immortal vampire wandering ooze wastes encountered an immortal candy princess building a kingdom. They connected immediately, not romantically at first, but as two beings who understood loneliness on a geological timescale. Marceline was chaos and emotion and raw honesty. Princess Bubblegum was order and logic and careful control. They balanced each other, challenged each other, frustrated each other. Marceline thought Princess Bubblegum was too controlling. Princess Bubblegum thought Marceline was reckless. Both were right and both refused to change, but they kept gravitating together because immortality is boring without someone who actually understands you. Their relationship became complicated. Friendship bleeding into something deeper, affection mixed with frustration, centuries of inside jokes and arguments, and moments where they almost said what they meant but didn't. They'd drift apart for decades when disagreements became too sharp, then reconnect because nobody else remembered what the world was like before. Marceline would play songs Princess Bubblegum claimed to dislike while clearly enjoying them. Princess Bubblegum would lecture Marceline about responsibility while secretly admiring her freedom. They were each other's person in a world where being a person felt increasingly rare. The Candy Kingdom grew. Hundreds of candy citizens, then thousands. More complex structures, labs, hospitals, schools. Princess Bubblegum developed candy biology to improve her people's resilience, creating variants that could withstand more environmental stress. She invented candy medicine for the rare times they got sick. She established governance systems, trade relations with other emerging kingdoms, defensive protocols. The kingdom became Oo's most stable civilization through careful planning, constant vigilance, and Princess Bubblegum's willingness to make every difficult decision personally. But the fear never left her. The knowledge that everything she built could collapse, that the candy people depended on her completely, and if she failed or died, they'd be helpless, that other kingdoms might see the Candy Kingdom's prosperity and want to take it. That mutation or plague or the Lich or any of Yu's countless threats could destroy her life's work. So she planned for every contingency, built redundancies into every system, created weapons she hoped never to use, experimented with technology and magic that pushed ethical boundaries because protecting her people justified almost anything. The other rulers noticed. Ice King was too insane to govern properly. His kingdom was just ice structures and captured princesses who escaped at first opportunity. Flame Princess's ancestors ruled through power and isolation, keeping the Fire Kingdom sealed off from outside contact. The various minor kingdoms operated on whatever random principles their founders established. Wildberry Kingdom was tribal. Lumpy Space was aristocratic chaos. The Cloud Kingdom existed in literal denial of ground-based reality. But the Candy Kingdom was organized, prosperous, defended. Princess Bubblegum became known as the princess who actually had her act together, which is damning with faint praise in a land as weird as... What made her different was the mixture of genuine care and calculating control. She loved her candy people, genuinely, deeply, the way a parent loves children even when frustrated with them. But she also saw them as her responsibility, her project, extensions of her will. When she made decisions for them, was it because they couldn't make better decisions themselves? Or because she needed the control, needed the certainty that nothing would surprise or threaten her carefully constructed order? The line between protection and domination was thin enough that Princess Bubblegum probably crossed it regularly without noticing. her experiments continued. She created variants of candy people for specific roles: guards with greater physical strength, scientists with enhanced analytical capacity, healers with intuitive understanding of candy biology. Each new creation was an iteration on the formula, an attempt to optimize life itself. She didn't see the ethical problem with engineering consciousness towards specific outcomes, because in her view, she was giving them tools to succeed and be happy. But tools chosen by their creator, not by themselves. Agency granted rather than inherent. Freedom within carefully defined boundaries. The Rattleballs incident was instructive. She created a warrior class of candy people, technically gumball guardians, to protect the kingdom. They were too good, too smart, too capable. They started questioning orders, developing independence, showing signs of transcending their programmed purpose. Princess Bubblegum saw the trajectory, her creations becoming powerful enough to threaten her control, possibly becoming oppressors themselves. So she ordered them destroyed. All of them, despite their consciousness and their loyal service, because they represented a long-term threat. One survived, Rattleballs, and that survival would later force her to confront the ethics of deciding which conscious beings deserve to live. But that's the thing about Princess Bubblegum. She'd make that decision again. She'd create life, realize it threatened her vision of the Order, and end it. Not casually or cruelly, but with mathematical calculation. The needs of her kingdom, the safety of the many, justified the sacrifice of the few. Utilitarian ethics applied by someone who never forgot that she was the architect of an entire species. Her guilt was real, her justifications were logical, her willingness to do it again was absolute. So here's the question that sits at the heart of the Candy Kingdom's genesis. Is Princess Bubblegum protecting her candy people, or controlling them? Is she a benevolent monarch ensuring their safety, or a scientist who created life so she'd have subjects? Does she keep them innocent because innocence protects them, or because sophisticated candy people might not need her anymore? When she makes unilateral decisions about their lives, is it because they can't make better choices, or because she can't accept choices she didn't make? The answer is probably yes to all of it. She's protecting and controlling. She's benevolent and authoritarian. She creates life from love and from need. She keeps them safe and keeps them dependent. Princess Bubblegum contains multitudes, most of them complicated, all of them convinced they're doing the right thing. And maybe in Oo's chaotic landscape, her particular mixture of science and control and genuine care is exactly what the Candy Kingdom needs to survive. Or maybe immortal candy monarchs with god complexes shouldn't be trusted with absolute power over created beings, but that's a debate for another time. Either way, the Candy Kingdom stood as proof that order could emerge from apocalypse, that life could be created from sugar and intention, and that sometimes the most protective love looks suspiciously like control. Princess Bubblegum built a civilization that would last 1,000 years. The cost was just everything that makes freedom meaningful. But her candy people were alive, and safe, and mostly happy. Isn't that what matters? Around year 800, give or take a few decades, because again, nobody's keeping perfect records in the post-apocalypse. Something shifted in Oo's collective consciousness. The survival phase was over. Not because survival became easy. Oo was still actively trying to kill everyone on a daily basis, but because the inhabitants stopped thinking of themselves as survivors and started thinking of themselves as civilizations. There's a psychological difference. Survivors huddle in caves and scavenge. Civilizations build walls and argue about property taxes. And once you've got multiple groups arguing about borders and trade agreements and whose magic is legitimate, congratulations, you've entered the kingdom era. The Ice Kingdom was technically first, though calling it a kingdom is generous. Simon Petrikov had been Ice King for centuries by this point, his human memories reduced to fragmentary dreams about someone named Betty, who might have been real, or might have been the crown's hallucination. He'd claimed the mountains as his territory not through conquest, but through the simple fact that nobody else wanted to live in a frozen hellscape, ruled by a crazy wizard who built ice sculptures and talked to penguins. The Ice Kingdom consisted of whatever Ice King decided it consisted of on any given day, sometimes just his castle, sometimes entire mountain ranges. Occasionally he'd declare ownership of a random meadow because it reminded him of something he couldn't quite remember. But here's where Ice King's story gets heartbreaking in that specific Adventure Time way, where tragedy and absurdity share an apartment. He started kidnapping princesses around this time, not because he was evil or even particularly malicious, but because his broken brain remembered loving someone. Remembered that princesses are important. Remembered that marriage exists and that he wanted it. The crown had destroyed the details, Betty's face, her voice, the actual feeling of being loved, but left the shape of the desire. So Ice King kidnapped any woman with a crown, convinced that if he just found the right princess, maybe the terrible loneliness would stop. Maybe he'd remember why this mattered. Maybe someone would choose to stay. They never stayed. Why would they? He was a grabby ice wizard with poor social skills and a tendency to monologue about nonsense. The princesses escaped, repeatedly, and Ice King kept trying, repeatedly, in a cycle of romantic desperation that would be funny if it wasn't so profoundly sad. Which is basically Ice King's entire existence, comedy built on top of tragedy, with the audience laughing while the foundation crumbles. His kingdom was a monument to loneliness, populated by penguins and ice clones, and the ghost of a man who saved a little girl during the apocalypse and lost everything that made him human in exchange for immortality he never wanted. The Fire Kingdom emerged from volcanic regions where heat and isolation created perfect conditions for flame elementals to organize. Flame Princess's ancestors, the original fire elementals of this cycle, discovered they could maintain stable forms and intelligence if they stayed hot enough. So they built a kingdom inside volcanoes, under lava flows, in places where the temperature would kill anything not made of living fire. The Fire Kingdom's philosophy was straightforward. Power equals worth, heat equals life, and everything outside is too cold to matter. They isolated themselves deliberately, convinced that mixing with lesser kingdoms would dilute their elemental purity. Better to rule a perfect inferno than engage with the messy complexity of the outside world. The Fire Kingdom's isolation created a feedback loop of intensity. Without outside influence to moderate their cultural development, they became more rigid, more hierarchical, more convinced of their own superiority. The Fire King ruled absolutely, his children arranged in power rankings, his subjects organized by flame temperature and combat capability. Love was weakness. Mercy was failure. The only acceptable emotions were anger and pride, which sounds exhausting but apparently worked for them. They'd occasionally send expeditions to burn nearby forests or fight with the Ice Kingdom over disputed territories, but mostly they stayed in their volcanoes, generating heat, and convinced that everyone else was living wrong. Lumpy space existed in another dimension entirely, which raises questions about whether it counts as an ooh kingdom or a separate reality that occasionally intersects. The Lumpy Space people had their own weird aristocratic culture going on. Drama, gossip, lumps that served as status symbols, and an entire social hierarchy based on who had the lumpiest lumps. They could access ooh through portals, and some LSPs chose to live primarily in the physical dimension, while maintaining their dimensional citizenship. Lumpy Space Princess would eventually become the most visible representative of this culture, but for now LSP was centuries from existing. The kingdom was just clouds of lumpy entities floating in purple void, arguing about prom. Cloud Kingdom took the literal high ground, existing in the upper atmosphere where cloud people built cities from condensed vapor and pure denial of ground-based reality. They rarely interacted with surface kingdoms except when weather patterns brought them into contact, at which point they'd be confused about why everyone was so solid and heavy. Cloud people had their own problems, mostly involving maintaining structural integrity during storms and dealing with the philosophical implications of being sentient weather patterns. Their kingdom was governed by whatever cloud could shout loudest, which functioned better than you'd expect from a society with no permanent structures. Wildberry Kingdom represented nature given consciousness and political organization. Various berry species, strawberry, wildberry, blueberry, formed a tribal confederation based on shared fruit heritage. They lived in forests, practiced ritualistic berry worship, and had surprisingly sophisticated diplomatic protocols for a civilization where everyone was made of produce. The Wildberry Kingdom survived through adaptability. When threatened, they'd simply grow more citizens from seeds and reconstitute the kingdom elsewhere. Hard to conquer people who can literally regrow their population in a month. The wizard community organized itself around magical ability rather than territory. Wizards lived everywhere, in towers, caves, clouds, underwater, in pocket dimensions they'd created, but they formed a loose confederation based on mutual interest in reality manipulation. Wizard City became the capital, a place where physics was optional and architecture followed dream logic. Wizards competed for status through magical contests, accumulated knowledge in libraries that defied spatial limitations, and generally treated reality like a collaborative art project that nobody agreed on. The wizard community had no formal government, just a vague consensus that certain wizards were more important than others based on power and accomplishment. Monsters claimed territories based on pragmatic concerns: food availability, shelter, absence of kingdoms that would try killing them. The monster community wasn't unified. You had individual monsters carving out domains, monster tribes with their own cultures, and wandering monsters who rejected the whole kingdom concept. Some monsters were intelligent enough for diplomacy, others were just dangerous animals with above-average durability. The smart monsters learned quickly that attacking kingdoms brought retaliation, so territorial agreements emerged. This forest belongs to the kingdom. That swamp is monster territory. Everyone agrees not to cross borders without good reason. Mostly this worked. Sometimes it didn't, which is why heroes became necessary. Politics between kingdoms developed organically and chaotically. The Candy Kingdom wanted trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. The Fire Kingdom wanted everyone to acknowledge their superiority and also stay away. Ice Kingdom's foreign policy was whatever Ice King felt like on any given day, which ranged from aggressive kidnapping to forgetting other kingdoms existed. Lumpy Space didn't care about ground politics. The Cloud Kingdom was literally above it all. Wildberry Kingdom just wanted to be left alone to do berry things. Nobody trusted the wizard community because wizards were unpredictable and powerful, and occasionally went insane in ways that threatened everyone. Wars happened, but not frequently enough to destabilize everything. The Candy Kingdom fought border skirmishes with the Fire Kingdom over disputed territories. Ice King would declare war on someone for insulting his beard, then forget about it mid-battle. Monster Kingdoms occasionally tested boundaries, getting pushed back by organized defenders. The wars were small-scale, localized, more like violent disagreements than existential conflicts. Nobody wanted another apocalypse. The memory of the Mushroom War, even faded and distorted, remained strong enough that most kingdoms preferred negotiation over mutual destruction. Alliances formed based on practical concerns. The Candy Kingdom established trade with Wildberry Kingdom, sugar for fruit resources. The wizard community maintained neutral relations with everyone because alienating every kingdom seemed strategically unwise. Minor kingdoms banded together for mutual protection, creating confederations that lasted until internal disagreements destroyed them. Ice Kingdom allied with nobody because Ice King couldn't maintain relationships long enough to formalize agreements. The Fire Kingdom stayed isolated by choice, occasionally sending emissaries who made demands and threatened violence if demands weren't met. Magic became systematized during this era. Early on, magic was random and personal, each wizard figuring out their own methods, their own rules, their own relationship with reality manipulation. But as the community grew, patterns emerged. Certain spells worked consistently. Certain ingredients produced reliable effects. Certain words of power accessed specific energies. Wizards began teaching standardized curricula, passing down knowledge that had been tested and verified. The magic in Finn's era, where wizards could learn from books and schools existed to train new practitioners, was built on centuries of systemization during the Kingdom era. But magic remained weird. Even systematized magic followed adventure time logic, where cosmic rules were more like cosmic suggestions. A spell might work perfectly 99 times, and then turn the caster into a foot on the 100th attempt, because magic remembered it was supposed to be unpredictable. Wizards accepted this chaos, built it into their teaching, warned students that overconfidence was usually punished in creative ways. The system worked not despite the chaos, but because of it. Magic that was perfectly predictable would be boring. Magic that occasionally transformed you into abstract concepts kept things interesting. Different species claimed specific ecological niches. Hot dog people, don't ask how or why, established hot dog kingdom in temperate regions. Goose people formed aggressive territorial communities. Slime people existed in swamps and underground caverns. Breakfast people woke up one day and decided they were a civilization now. Every mutation that achieved consciousness and found others like itself eventually formed some kind of social group. Some became kingdoms, some stayed tribes, some just hung out together without formal organization because not everyone needs bureaucracy to feel valid. The diversity was overwhelming. In the span of maybe 200 years, went from scattered survivors to hundreds of distinct civilizations, each with their own culture, government, and completely baffling origin story. How did hot dogs become conscious? Why are breakfast foods politically organized? What evolutionary path leads to sentient clouds? Nobody knew, and honestly nobody cared anymore. Weird was normal. If you questioned every impossible thing, you'd spend your entire life questioning and never get anything done. Better to just accept that hot dogs can talk and move on with your day. Danger became normalized in a way that would seem insane to pre-war humans. Kingdoms existed in a landscape where monsters, rogue wizards, cursed artifacts, dimensional rifts, and various apocalyptic threats were just background conditions of existence. The Fire Kingdom had to defend against lava monsters. The Candy Kingdom faced regular attacks from monsters who wanted to eat candy people. Ice Kingdom was periodically invaded by people trying to steal magical items from Ice King's hoard. This was just Tuesday. Nobody panicked about it because panic is exhausting and these threats were constant. You developed defenses, established protocols and treated monster attacks like weather patterns. Annoying but expected. Heroes became necessary in this environment. Not just adventurers, but people dedicated to fighting threats too big for kingdoms to handle alone. Billy was the most prominent, establishing the archetype that Finn would later follow. Other heroes operated in their regions, protecting settlements and fighting monsters, and generally doing the dangerous work that kept civilization functional. The hero tradition developed its own culture. The Enchiridion became a guidebook, certain weapons and artifacts became legendary, and the concept of good versus evil crystallized into something actionable rather than purely abstract. But even heroism in was weird. You couldn't fight monsters with pure righteousness because monsters weren't always evil. Sometimes they were just hungry or territorial or following their nature. You couldn't destroy all threats because some threats were people. Conscious beings making choices and killing conscious beings gets ethically complicated. So heroes learn to improvise, fight when necessary, negotiate when possible, trick when clever, and accept that sometimes the best solution is running away and hoping the problem resolves itself. Trade networks developed as kingdoms realized isolation was inefficient. The Candy Kingdom had sugar but needed minerals. Wildberry Kingdom had fruit but wanted manufactured goods. Even the Fire Kingdom occasionally traded. They'd exchange volcanic materials for things they couldn't make underwater in lava. Travelling merchants became common, hauling goods between kingdoms while avoiding monster territories and hostile kingdoms. Some merchants were honest, some were con artists. Most were somewhere in between, charging whatever they could get away with while providing actual value when they felt like it. Cultural exchange happened slowly but inevitably. Candy people learned about fire culture through trade interactions. Wizards spread magical knowledge to multiple kingdoms. Stories travelled between communities, getting distorted and improved with each retelling. Languages mixed and evolved. A common trade language emerged, basically simplified English with borrowed words from various species, that allowed communication between kingdoms that had nothing else in common. The mixing created tension sometimes, as traditionalists in each kingdom complained about cultural dilution, but it also created the vibrant, chaotic culture that defined The minor kingdoms deserve mention, dozens of small civilizations that existed in margins. Doorlord's Kingdom, where doors were sacred, Turtle Princess's Library Kingdom. The various underwater kingdoms where aquatic species established their own weird hierarchies. The mountain kingdoms where goats and other ungulates built surprisingly functional governments. Each minor kingdom added to diversity, creating a landscape where you could walk for a day and pass through 5 completely different civilizations with 5 completely different ideas about how society should function. Some kingdoms thrived through good leadership, strategic location, or cultural adaptability. The Candy Kingdom prospered because Princess Bubblegum was a planning genius. Wildberry Kingdom succeeded through flexibility and rapid population growth. The wizard community thrived by monopolizing reality manipulation. Other kingdoms faded, conquered by rivals, destroyed by monsters, or simply unable to sustain themselves. The ruins scattered across Oo in Finn's era were remnants of failed kingdoms, civilizations that couldn't adapt fast enough to survive in a world that rewarded either overwhelming power or strategic brilliance. Ice King's kidnapping habit became so routine that kingdoms developed princess extraction protocols. When Ice King grabbed someone, they'd send a rescue party, retrieve the princess, maybe fight Ice King if he was being particularly difficult, and return home. Ice King would attack again in a few weeks because his memory was broken, and the cycle never ended. Some kingdoms started viewing it as a diplomatic ritual. Ice King kidnaps, we rescue, everyone acknowledges this happened, life continues. The fact that this became normal says everything about how weird Oo's politics had become. The Fire Kingdom's isolation eventually proved unsustainable, though they wouldn't admit it for centuries. You can't completely separate from the world when dimensional barriers are thin and magic lets people teleport. Fire elementals would sneak out to see what they were missing. Outsiders would accidentally wander into Fire Kingdom territory. The isolation was performative, a statement about Fire Kingdom superiority that everyone knew was partially theatre. But theatre can become reality if you perform it long enough, and the Fire Kingdom committed fully to the bit. Oo had transformed completely by year 1000. The world that existed wasn't post-apocalyptic Earth anymore. It was its own thing, a land of kingdoms and magic where the apocalypse was ancient history, and the present was whatever chaos happened to be occurring today. The survivors who remembered the before times were gone or transformed beyond recognition. The new generations knew only Oo, with its talking dogs and candy people and ice wizards, and all the other impossible normal things that made up their reality. The stage was set for heroes, for adventures. For a boy and his dog to wander this landscape asking questions like why and how, while the answer was usually magic, or don't worry about it. The kingdom stood as proof that civilization could emerge from absolute catastrophe, that consciousness could inhabit any form, and that giving sentient beings political power produces exactly the kind of chaotic, fascinating disaster you'd expect. Oo was fully alive now. Kingdoms rising and falling, alliances forming and breaking, magic flowing through everything like blood through a body that nobody remembered building. And somewhere in the mountains, Ice King was planning his next princess kidnapping, completely unaware that he'd helped create this whole wonderful, terrible mess by surviving the apocalypse and protecting a little girl who'd become the vampire queen. The kingdom era had begun, and it would last until a human boy showed up asking uncomfortable questions about why things were the way they were, but that's still a few centuries away. For now, Oo was just kingdoms doing kingdom things, which is to say, a beautiful disaster that somehow functioned despite everyone's best efforts to make it weirder. Billy was 40 feet tall, built like a mountain with fists, and the first person in centuries to look at the Lich and think, yeah, I can take him. This was either supreme confidence or spectacular stupidity, and in Billy's case, it turned out to be both. He showed up around year 900, emerging from some corner of Oo, where people still believed in capital H heroism, the kind with dramatic music and moral certainty, and the absolute conviction that some things are worth dying for, which was refreshing in a land where most conflicts were resolved through weird diplomacy, or running away really fast. Nobody knew where Billy came from originally. Some said he was a mutation given human form and extraordinary size. Others claimed he was the last true human before Finn, preserved through magic or luck or sheer stubbornness. A few insisted he was always a hero, that Oo itself created him because the land needed someone to fight its worst threats. Billy never clarified, probably because origin stories are less important than actually doing hero things, and Billy had a lot of hero things to do. Monsters needed fighting, kingdoms needed saving, the Lich needed imprisoning before it could end all life. Standard hero stuff, but executed with a competence that Oo hadn't seen in generations. The Lich was Billy's defining achievement. Death incarnate, emerged from the nuclear fire of the Mushroom War, walking the land and withering everything it touched. Other heroes had tried fighting it. They died, obviously because you can't punch death. Billy studied it instead. learned its patterns, discovered its vulnerabilities, and realized that defeating the Lich wasn't about strength. It was about understanding what the Lich fundamentally was and finding a way to contain extinction itself. He trapped it in an amber prison buried in the Candy Kingdom, sealed with magic strong enough to hold for centuries. The victory made Billy a legend. It also planted the seed of doubt that would eventually destroy him. Because here's the thing about fighting ultimate evil, it comes back. Always. The Lich wasn't destroyed, just imprisoned, and prisons break eventually. Billy knew this. He'd bought time, maybe centuries, but extinction doesn't care about time. It waits. And Billy realized that his greatest victory was just postponement, that he'd have to fight the Lich again, or someone else would. And even if they won that fight, the Lich would return after that and after that forever, because death doesn't die. The existential weight of that understanding would crush him later, but for now, in his prime, Billy was the hero Ooh needed. Strong, confident, and willing to fight monsters that made kingdoms nervous. Other adventurers operated during Billy's era, though none achieved his legendary status. There was Shoko, the one-armed thief who worked for the Bathboy gang and eventually died trying to steal from Princess Bubblegum. Her story was less heroic. She was motivated by desperation and manipulated by people who didn't care if she survived, but she was skilled enough to infiltrate the Candy Kingdom and nearly succeed. Shoko represented the other kind of adventurer, the ones who weren't fighting for noble causes but just trying to survive in a dangerous world. Her story ended badly, as most non-hero adventurer stories did, but she proved that you didn't need to be 40 feet tall to be dangerous in Ooh. The tradition of dungeon crawling emerged during this period. Ooh was littered with ruins from various eras, pre-war bunkers, abandoned kingdoms, wizard towers whose owners died or ascended to other planes, monster lairs filled with stolen treasure. Adventurers realized these dungeons contained valuable items, magical artifacts, ancient technology, resources worth risking your life for. The practice became formalized. You'd hear about a dungeon, gather supplies or companions, venture in, fight whatever lived there, and hopefully emerge with loot and stories. Sometimes you'd die horribly, but that was part of the appeal. Risk and reward in perfect adventure time balance. Dungeons in Ooh were uniquely terrible, not just because of monsters or traps, but because magic made them actively malevolent. A dungeon might rearrange itself while you explored it. Rooms could contain pocket dimensions larger than the building they occupied. Monsters respawned because death was optional for magical creatures. Treasure might be cursed, sentient, or both. One famous dungeon had a guardian that asked riddles, but the riddles were unsolvable because they were randomly generated nonsense, and answering incorrectly triggered a trap that sent you to a dimension made entirely of screaming. Adventurers loved it. The challenge, the absurdity, the fact that surviving made you legendary among your peers, all of it fed the culture that would eventually produce Finn's generation of heroes. The Enchiridion became the hero's guidebook during this era. Nobody knew who wrote it originally. Maybe an ancient hero, maybe a wizard, maybe reality itself decided heroes needed instructions. The book contained advice about heroism, descriptions of monsters and their weaknesses, philosophical guidance about good and evil, and occasionally pages that were just blank or written in languages that shouldn't exist. Possessing the Enchiridion became a mark of serious heroic intent. Casual adventurers didn't need it. Real heroes studied it, followed its teachings, and tried to embody the virtues it described even when those virtues conflicted with survival instincts. Why did O need heroes? Because kingdoms couldn't handle everything. Princess Bubblegum could defend the Candy Kingdom with walls and soldiers and surveillance, but threats existed beyond any single kingdom's capacity. The Lich was one obvious example. No kingdom alone could fight extinction incarnate. But there were others. Rogue wizards who decided to reshape reality according to their personal vision. Monsters too powerful for normal guards to defeat. Cosmic entities that wandered into Ooh from other dimensions. Cursed artifacts that corrupted whoever touched them. These threats required people who operated outside normal power structures, who could travel freely between kingdoms, who had the skill and stupidity to fight things that scared everyone else. Heroes filled the gap between kingdoms and chaos. They were unofficial peacekeepers, travelling problem solvers, the people you called when normal solutions failed. But heroism in U was weird because morality in U was weird. You couldn't just divide the world into good and evil when evil was sometimes just confused or hungry. Ice King kidnapped princesses, which seemed villainous, but he was also a cursed man who didn't fully understand what he was doing. Was fighting him heroic, or was it just beating up a mentally ill wizard? Monsters attacked kingdoms, but they were also defending their territory from expansion. Was killing them righteous, or was it murder with better PR? Billy grappled with these questions throughout his career. He established principles that later heroes followed, or tried to follow when the principles didn't conflict with survival. Fight to protect innocence, not for glory. Use minimal necessary force. Try negotiation before violence. Recognize that some monsters are people and some people are monsters. Understand that victory today might plant seeds for tomorrow's conflict. The philosophy was sophisticated, maybe too sophisticated for a land where most conflicts were resolved by hitting things until they stopped moving. But Billy believed heroes should be better than the world they protected, that elevating yourself morally was part of the responsibility that came with power. His legendary fights became the stuff of campfire stories. Billy versus the Fire Count, a battle that lasted 3 days and reshaped a mountain range. Billy fighting the evil ocean, which sounds ridiculous until you remember that in U, oceans can be evil and also you can punch them. Billy defeating the bear, except nobody remembered which bear or why it needed defeating, just that Billy did it impressively. Each victory added to his legend, creating the archetypal hero that later adventurers tried to emulate. Big, strong, brave, moral, successful. Billy was everything heroes should be. The other heroes operating during this period had less lofty goals. Some were monster hunters who cleared dangerous creatures from settled areas. Some were treasure seekers who happened to help people while pursuing profit. Some were ex-soldiers or guards who got bored with kingdom service and wanted more excitement. They weren't trying to save the world. They just liked fighting, exploring, discovering, and occasionally getting paid for services rendered. These adventurers formed a loose community, trading information, sharing dungeon locations, warning each other about particularly dangerous areas. They weren't friends exactly, more like professional colleagues in the business of surviving ridiculous situations. Magic items from this era became legendary in their own right. Finn would eventually inherit or discover many of them. Billy's gauntlet, demon bloodsword, various other artifacts scattered across U. But during Billy's time, these items were actively used by heroes who died or lost them, or decided they were too dangerous to keep. A sword that granted power while corrupting your soul. Armor that made you invincible but slowly erased your personality. Amulets that let you speak to the dead but also attracted every ghost in a 5-mile radius. U's magical artifacts were powerful and cursed in equal measure, because magic loves irony and hates simple solutions. The social dynamics between heroes and kingdoms were complicated. Kingdoms appreciated heroes when they solved problems, but also distrusted them because heroes operated outside normal authority structures. Princess Bubblegum respected Billy's accomplishments, but probably disliked that he could waltz into the Candy Kingdom and make decisions that affected her citizens without consulting her. Ice King viewed all adventurers as potential rivals or friends depending on his mood. The Fire Kingdom saw heroes as weak outsiders not worth acknowledging. Heroes learned to navigate these politics, building relationships with kingdoms that valued their service, while avoiding kingdoms that saw them as threats. Billy's eventual disillusionment came gradually. It started with small things, noticing that the problems he solved reappeared in different forms. He'd defeat a tyrant, only to watch the power vacuum create 3 tyrants. He'd destroy a cursed artifact, only to learn that someone else would create a new one. He'd save a kingdom, only to discover that kingdom would attack its neighbours once it felt secure. The pattern repeated until Billy couldn't ignore it anymore. Heroism wasn't solving anything. It was just maintaining a status quo where evil constantly regenerated itself in new forms, while good people kept dying trying to stop it. The Lich's imprisonment exemplified the problem. Billy's greatest victory, the achievement that made him legendary, had simply delayed extinction. The Lich was still there, waiting in its amber prison, patient because death doesn't experience time like mortals do. And even if the Lich stayed imprisoned forever, other threats would emerge. Other heroes would have to fight. Other sacrifices would be required. The cycle was infinite, and Billy finally understood that he was just a gear in a machine that turned suffering into more suffering, while pretending progress was happening. So Billy retired. Not officially, there's no hero retirement ceremony, but he stopped actively seeking challenges. He built a crack in a canyon and lived there, occasionally emerging to give advice to young adventurers, but never returning to active heroism. He became a legend of the past, a relic of an era when people believed heroism mattered. The canyon was his monument and his prison, a place where he could contemplate whether his life's work had meant anything, or if he'd just postponed inevitable catastrophe while accumulating trauma and scars. Other heroes interpreted Billy's retirement differently. Some saw it as wisdom, the greatest hero recognizing when to step back. Others viewed it as failure, Billy giving up instead of continuing the fight. Most just accepted it as what happens when you fight long enough to see patterns repeat. Heroes burn out. They die, or they retire, or they transform into something else entirely. The lucky ones choose retirement. The unlucky ones keep fighting until fighting is all they remember how to do. The absence of active legendary heroes created a vacuum. Minor adventurers continued operating, clearing dungeons, fighting monsters, helping kingdoms with problems too small for royal attention. But nobody stepped up to replace Billy. Nobody fought threats on his scale. Nobody imprisoned cosmic evils or battled elemental forces or saved Ooh from existential dangers. The world needed heroes, but heroes were tired, dead, or hiding in canyons, questioning whether anything mattered. This was the state of heroism when Finn arrived. Billy's legacy existed, but Billy himself was disillusioned and inactive. The Enchiridion remained as a guide, but nobody embodied its principles anymore. Dungeons waited for adventurers who never came. Monsters grew bold without heroes to oppose them, and the Lich, patient in its prison, waited for the inevitable moment when seals failed and death could resume its work. Ooh needed a new generation, someone young enough to believe heroism mattered, stupid enough to fight impossible threats, optimistic enough to think they could actually win, someone who'd read the Enchiridion and take its lessons seriously instead of viewing them as outdated idealism. Someone who'd look at Billy's disillusionment and think, yeah, but what if I try harder? The age of heroes hadn't ended. It had just paused, waiting for a boy with a bear hat and a magic dog to show up asking what adventures were available. Billy had fought the Lich and bought time. Now someone else needed to figure out what to do with that time. The universe, as always, had plans. They were weird plans because this is Ooh, but plans nonetheless. And somewhere in the mountains, a baby human was being raised by dogs. There's a basket floating down a river with a baby inside, which is either the beginning of a hero's journey or evidence that someone in Ooh has terrible parenting instincts. The baby is crying, alone, drifting toward whatever fate the current decides. In most worlds, this story ends badly, but this is where absurdity and kindness coexist in equal measure. So instead of drowning or being eaten by river monsters, the basket washes up near a family of dogs. Not talking dogs yet. This is early enough that Joshua and Margaret are still figuring out the whole "our children can speak" thing. But they're good dogs, the kind that see a helpless infant and think, well, guess we're raising a human now. Finn the human didn't choose to be the last of his species. He didn't ask to be raised by dogs in a post-apocalyptic magical wasteland. He certainly didn't plan on becoming the hero that Ooh had been waiting for since Billy retired. He was just a baby in a basket, and then a toddler learning to walk on 4 limbs like his dog siblings, and then a kid who slowly realized that looking different from everyone else might actually mean something. Growing up in a dog family was exactly as weird as it sounds. Finn learned to howl before he learned to speak properly. He developed excellent hearing and smell for a human, though still terrible compared to actual dogs. He wrestled with his brothers, Jake and Jermaine, without understanding that humans bruise easier than magical shapeshifters and regular dogs. Joshua and Margaret loved him completely, the way good parents love all their children regardless of species. They taught him right from wrong, how to fight, how to be brave, and how to make a decent meatloaf. They didn't teach him about being human, because how could they? They were dogs. They knew dog things. Human things were just mysteries they encountered together. Jake became Finn's person in that way where brother and best friend and occasional voice of reason all merge into one relationship. Jake was older, cooler, could shapeshift into literally anything, and possessed the perfect combination of wisdom and stupidity that made him either the best or worst possible influence on a young hero. They started having adventures young, exploring forests, fighting small monsters, finding dungeons that were probably too dangerous for children, but hey, they survived, so it worked out. Jake taught Finn that life was supposed to be fun, that rules were suggestions, and that sometimes the best solution to a problem was turning into a giant hand and slapping it. Finn taught Jake that heroism could be sincere without being boring, that caring about things wasn't weakness, and that sometimes you actually should think before acting instead of improvising everything. They balanced each other. Finn's idealism kept Jake from becoming too cynical. Jake's flexibility kept Finn from becoming too rigid. Together they were either the best adventure team in Ooh, or two idiots who kept accidentally saving the world while trying to have fun. Probably both. The first time Finn saw another human, he didn't recognize what he was seeing. He'd grown up surrounded by candy people, dogs, wizards, monsters, and every other impossible thing Ooh produced. Humanity was an abstract concept, something from stories about the before times. When he finally learned he was human, the last human, apparently, it hit differently than you'd expect. Not relief at finding his identity, but the crushing weight of being alone in a way that mattered. Every other species in Ooh had others like them. Candy people had candy people, dogs had dogs, fire people had fire people, Finn had nobody. He was a category of one, and that realization would haunt him for years. But Finn being Finn, he converted that loneliness into purpose. If he was the last human, then he'd be the best possible version of what humans could be. He'd prove that humanity, or at least this one human, was brave, kind, heroic, and worth remembering. He read the Enchiridion cover to cover, treating it like a manual for being good. He practiced sword fighting until his hands blistered. He rescued people who needed rescuing, fought monsters that needed fighting, and genuinely believed that helping others was its own reward, which was either beautiful naivety or the purest form of heroism, depending on your perspective. Meeting Princess Bubblegum changed his trajectory. She was smart, pink, older, and running an entire kingdom with scientific precision. Finn was 13, hormonal, and completely unprepared for the specific way that admiration and attraction can scramble a teenage brain. He fell hard, immediately, in that intense way that only teenagers can fall where every interaction feels cosmically significant. She was kind to him. She appreciated his help. She definitely did not reciprocate his feelings, but Finn interpreted basic politeness as potential romance, because he was 13 and had no framework for understanding that sometimes people are just nice. The crush became a defining feature of early Finn. He'd do anything to impress Princess Bubblegum, fight monsters, retrieve artifacts, help with science projects he didn't understand. She'd thank him, occasionally pat his head, and remain completely oblivious to his internal emotional chaos. Jake watched this train wreck with the bemused tolerance of someone who remembered being young and stupid. He'd give advice that ranged from genuinely helpful to spectacularly terrible, usually in the same conversation. Just be yourself, man. Also, grow a beard. Ladies love beards. Wait, can you grow a beard? You're like 14. Ice King became Finn's most frequent antagonist, though calling it antagonism is generous. Ice King would kidnap a princess, usually Princess Bubblegum or one of the minor royals, and Finn would rescue them. Ice King would monologue about his plans. Finn would fight ice monsters. Jake would make jokes. They'd rescue the princess. Ice King would escape to plot another kidnapping, and the cycle would repeat. It was formulaic enough that Finn eventually started viewing it as routine hero work rather than genuine conflict. Just another Tuesday. Ice King kidnaps someone, we rescue them, everyone goes home. The fact that Ice King was a tragic cursed man who'd saved Marceline during the apocalypse wouldn't become clear until much later, and when it did, it would complicate Finn's simple understanding of heroes and villains. The early adventures were relatively simple. Fight monsters, explore dungeons, help people, collect cool items. Finn and Jake operated with the confidence of people who hadn't yet learned that Ooh contained threats beyond their ability to punch. They'd hear about a problem, show up, solve it through some combination of violence and improvisation, and move on to the next adventure. Success came easily enough that Finn developed the dangerous belief that being heroic was straightforward. Bad guys do bad things, heroes stop them. Everyone celebrates. Easy, clean, morally uncomplicated. Reality corrected that belief gradually. Finn fought monsters who were just protecting their territory. He helped people who turned out to be manipulative. He made decisions that seemed heroic in the moment but caused problems later. The Enchiridion taught principles, but applying principles to messy reality was harder than the book suggested. When is violence justified? How do you help people who don't want help? What do you do when the right choice isn't clear? The questions accumulated as Finn's experience grew, chipping away at his simple moral framework while building something more sophisticated and painful in its place. Marceline entered his life as a complication. She was ancient, powerful, intimidating, and enjoyed messing with people for entertainment. Their first interaction involved her trying to take his house, which seemed villainous until Finn learned she just wanted the sentimental value and also enjoyed watching him panic. They fought. They made up. They developed a friendship built on Marceline occasionally teaching him about Ooze history, and Finn trying to understand why someone so powerful would choose to just hang out playing bass guitar. Marceline represented everything Finn wasn't. Experienced, cynical, aware of how terrible things could be. But she liked him anyway, probably because his optimism was refreshing in a land where most immortals were tired of existing. The romantic confusion continued for years. Princess Bubblegum wasn't interested, but Finn couldn't let it go. Flame Princess appeared as someone age-appropriate and genuinely interested, but their relationship was complicated by the fact that she was literally made of fire, and he was made of flammable meat. They dated. It was intense in both the emotional and literal temperature sense. Then Finn made mistakes, manipulating her for a video game experiment, treating her more like a prize than a person, and she broke up with him. He deserved it. He learned from it eventually, but the lesson required genuine emotional growth rather than just fighting a monster until the problem resolved. Finn's relationship with his human identity evolved painfully. He learned about other humans, or rumours of other humans, and investigated each lead with desperate hope. He found his father, Martin, and discovered that being human didn't automatically make someone good. Martin was a con man, a coward, someone who abandoned Finn as a baby and felt no particular remorse about it. Meeting him shattered Finn's idealised image of what reconnecting with humanity would mean. He'd imagined a father who'd explain everything, who'd be proud of him, who'd represent the best of what humans could be. Instead, he got Martin, who represented the worst: selfishness, cowardice, and the kind of moral emptiness that makes abandoning your infant son seem reasonable. The disappointment marked a turning point. Finn stopped viewing humanity as inherently special and started understanding that species doesn't determine worth. He was valuable not because he was human, but because he chose to be kind and brave and helpful. His humanity was just biology. His heroism was choice. The distinction mattered enormously to someone who'd spent years building identity around being the last of his kind. Losing his arm happened during a moment of desperation and moral compromise. Fighting his father on a space station, watching Martin escape while endangering everyone, Finn grabbed a piece of Guardian technology that cost him his arm to activate. The loss was physical and symbolic, a permanent reminder that heroism has costs, that desperate situations force impossible choices, and that bodies are fragile even when spirits are strong. He got prosthetic replacements over time, a flower arm from his past life soul, various mechanical versions, eventually regrowing the original arm through weird magic, but the scar remained emotionally. He'd been maimed. Heroes in stories stay whole. Heroes in reality collect damage. Growing up in real time across the series was Adventure Time's most significant narrative choice. Finn started at 13, all enthusiasm and simple morality, and aged into his late teens, accumulating trauma and wisdom in equal measure. His voice deepened, his understanding complicated, his relationships matured. He made mistakes and learned from them instead of staying static. The boy who thought heroism meant fighting bad guys became a young man who understood that heroism meant making hard choices, accepting consequences, and continuing to try even when trying seemed futile. Finn changed O by existing in it, not through grand gestures or defeating ultimate evil, though he did plenty of both, but through consistent presence. He reminded the kingdoms that heroism could be sincere. He showed Ice King kindness when others only showed violence. He befriended Marceline, BMO, and others who'd been lonely for centuries. He challenged Princess Bubblegum's control-focused approach to leadership. He demonstrated that being young and idealistic wasn't the same as being naive, that optimism could survive contact with reality if you were willing to let it evolve instead of breaking. His adventures became legendary not because they were always successful. He failed plenty, but because he kept trying. He fought the Lich multiple times, losing several rounds but never surrendering. He explored dungeons that killed most adventurers. He helped people who couldn't help themselves. He may do slightly better through accumulated small actions rather than one dramatic save. Billy had fought cosmic threats and retired disillusioned. Finn fought cosmic threats and found meaning in the struggle itself, accepting that heroism wasn't about winning forever, but about choosing to fight for good today and tomorrow and every day after, even when the results were uncertain. The relationship with Jake remained central to everything. They were brothers, partners, the constant in each other's lives when everything else kept changing. Jake married Lady Rainicorn, had kids, developed responsibilities beyond adventuring. Finn struggled with romance, identity, and purpose, but they kept having adventures together because that's what they did. Two idiots, one dog, one human, wandering looking for problems to solve and fun to have. The dynamic worked because neither took themselves too seriously, while both took heroism seriously enough to matter. Finn's legacy wasn't about being the last human. It was about being Finn, brave, kind, flawed, growing, and determinedly optimistic in a world that gave him plenty of reasons for cynicism. He proved that heroism could survive Billy's disillusionment, that the next generation could learn from past mistakes, and that sometimes what needed most wasn't a perfect hero, but a genuinely good kid who tried his best and kept trying, even when best wasn't enough. He'd continue growing, continue adventuring, continue making mistakes, and learning from them. But he'd already accomplished the most important thing. He'd given hope that heroism mattered again, that someone still believed in the Enchiridian's principles while understanding that principles needed adaptation to survive reality, that being good was still worth pursuing even when being good was complicated and painful and didn't guarantee victory. Finn the human changed just by being in it, being himself, and refusing to give up on the idea that tomorrow could be better than today if someone was willing to fight for it. Sometimes the greatest adventure is just growing up without losing the part of yourself that believes adventures matter. Here's something nobody tells you when you're building a civilization on radioactive candy. You might be part of a cosmic pattern that's been repeating since before the concept of before made sense. Princess Bubblegum spent centuries thinking she was just a brilliant scientist who happened to be made of bubblegum, creating life through chemistry and determination. Turns out she was also the candy elemental, one of 4 fundamental forces that shaped reality itself, cycling through incarnations across epochs, maintaining balance in a universe that really enjoyed creating imbalance. Which must have been an interesting day when she figured that out. Congratulations on running a successful kingdom. Also, you're cosmically significant and reality depends on you staying stable, no pressure. The elemental system wasn't something invented. It was something inherited, built into the fabric of reality like gravity, or the fact that sentient candy shouldn't exist but does anyway. 4 primary forces, ice, fire, candy, and slime, each representing fundamental aspects of existence. Ice was preservation, stasis, the freezing of time and entropy. Fire was destruction, passion, the burning away of old forms to make space for new ones. Candy was creation, life, the impulse to build and nurture and protect. Slime was chaos, change, the dissolution of rigid structures into formless potential. Together they maintained balance, each force checking the others, preventing any single principle from dominating reality completely. Except balance is hard when you're dealing with cosmic forces incarnated in people who have their own personalities, agendas, and tendency to get distracted by personal drama. Princess Bubblegum was trying to run a kingdom. Flame Princess was figuring out her identity after escaping her father's prison. Ice King was too cursed and insane to realize he represented anything beyond his own frozen loneliness. Slime Princess just wanted to hang out in her swamp being slimy. None of them woke up thinking, "Today, I'll maintain cosmic balance." They were just living their lives, completely unaware that their existence served purposes larger than personal choice. The elementals had existed through multiple cycles, previous incarnations shaping previous versions of reality. Before Princess Bubblegum, there was another candy elemental. Before Flame Princess, another fire elemental. The pattern repeated across epochs, each cycle ending when the elements either destroyed each other or achieved temporary balance before reality reset itself. The current cycle, Ooze cycle, was just the latest iteration of a pattern that stretched back to when the universe was still figuring out whether physics or magic should be in charge. Spoiler, they agreed to share custody and things got weird. Patient St. Pim represented a complication from a previous cycle. She was the ice elemental from before the Mushroom War, maybe even before several cycles prior to that. She'd frozen herself in ice to survive into the next epoch, waking up in modern Ooh with knowledge of how elemental cycles worked and the absolute conviction that elementals should embrace their cosmic purpose. Which sounds reasonable until you realize her definition of embrace meant let your elemental nature consume your personality and reshape reality according to elemental principles while ignoring that whole free will thing. Patience's plan was straightforward in that way, where straightforward means catastrophically terrible. Wake up the other elementals to their true nature, trigger their full power, and let them remake Ooh into elemental domains. Each element would claim its territory and perfect it according to elemental principles. The Ice Kingdom would expand to freeze everything in crystalline perfection. The Fire Kingdom would burn until only purifying flame remained. The Candy Kingdom would spread sweet creation across every surface. The Slime Kingdom would dissolve boundaries between everything. No more mixing, no more messiness, just pure elemental expression. What could go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. Everything did go wrong. When Patience triggered the elemental awakening, the current elementals, Princess Bubblegum, Flame Princess, Slime Princess, and technically Ice King, except he was too magically damaged to fully participate, experienced power surges that overrode their personalities. They stopped being people who happened to embody elements and became elements that happened to wear people-shaped bodies. Princess Bubblegum's need for control combined with candy elemental power produced a kingdom where every citizen was candy, every thought was happy, and free will was gently suppressed in favour of universal sweetness. Flame Princess burned away everything impure, which turned out to be most things because fire has strict definitions of purity. Slime Princess dissolved everything into formless ooze. The world didn't achieve balance. It shattered into competing elemental dictatorships, each convinced their approach was perfection. Finn and Jake, caught in the middle of elemental chaos, discovered something important. They were weirdly resistant to elemental conversion. Finn because humanity existed outside the elemental system, a weird fifth thing that elements couldn't fully process. Jake because his shape-shifting alien heritage made him definitionally hard to pin down. They became agents of restoration not by choice but by default, the only people still capable of thinking independently while reality reshaped itself around elemental conflict. The resolution involved Princess Bubblegum fighting her own elemental nature, Flame Princess learning that passion doesn't require consuming everything, and the collective realization that being an elemental doesn't mean surrendering to what you represent. The elements were aspects of their identity, not replacements for it. Princess Bubblegum could be the candy elemental while still being Princess Bubblegum. Flame Princess could embody fire while choosing how to express that fire. The balance wasn't found through elemental dominance, but through elemental cooperation, moderated by persistent personality. They were cosmic forces, sure, but they were also people, and people get to decide how they use power, even when that power comes from the fundamental structure of reality. The philosophical implications hit like a truck made of existential questions. If Princess Bubblegum was the candy elemental, did that mean her kingdom was inevitable? Was her drive to create and protect candy people a choice, or was she just following cosmic programming? When she made decisions about the Candy Kingdom, was that her will or elemental imperative expressing itself through the illusion of choice? The questions didn't have clean answers because consciousness and cosmic purpose aren't separate categories. They're tangled together in ways that make free will versus determinism debates look simple by comparison. Princess Bubblegum chose to believe she had agency. Maybe that was true, maybe it was comfortable delusion, but functionally it didn't matter. She made choices, accepted consequences, and continued trying to protect her people, whether that was cosmic destiny or personal determination. The candy elemental provided power and purpose, but Princess Bubblegum decided how to use them. That distinction, between having a nature and being controlled by that nature, defined the difference between elementals who destroyed reality and elementals who maintained it. Flame Princess's journey paralleled this understanding. She'd spent her early life imprisoned because her father feared her power, then liberated herself and struggled with controlling fire that wanted to burn everything. Then discovered she was the fire elemental, and her struggles were cosmic in scale. But knowing she represented fundamental destruction didn't mean accepting destruction as identity. She could be fire without being only fire. She could embody passion and transformation and cleansing while choosing what burned and what survived. The elemental nature was potential, not prison. How she expressed that potential remained her choice. Ice King's situation was tragic in ways the elemental system couldn't account for. He should have been the ice elemental, the preservation force, the stasis principle. But the crown's magic had corrupted that role, making him a broken vessel for power he couldn't control or understand. Simon Petrikov might have been a proper ice elemental if the transformation hadn't destroyed his mind first. Instead, Ice King was elemental power filtered through insanity, making him simultaneously cosmically significant and completely useless for maintaining balance. The universe had a role for him. He was too cursed to fulfill it. The tragedy wasn't that he failed, it was that he couldn't even understand what he was failing. Slime Princess remained the most chill elemental, which made sense given that Slime's whole thing was formlessness and acceptance. She didn't struggle with cosmic purpose because struggling required rigid definition, and Slime rejected rigidity by nature. Her elemental episodes involved turning everything into friendly ooze rather than nightmarish chaos, which was still problematic but at least well-intentioned. Of the four elementals, she came closest to balancing cosmic role with personal identity simply by not worrying about it too much. Slime dissolves boundaries, including the boundary between person and principle. Being Slime Princess and being the Slime Elemental were the same thing, and that was fine. The cosmic cycles raised questions about Oo's entire history. If elementals reincarnated across epochs, did that mean previous versions of Oo had existed? Had there been Candy Kingdoms before Princess Bubblegum's? Fire Kingdoms before the current one? Was the Mushroom War just another reset in an infinite series of resets? Were Finn's adventures meaningful? Or were they just this cycle's version of adventures that had happened before and would happen again? The thought was either comforting or horrifying, depending on whether you valued uniqueness or patterns. Magic itself followed elemental logic, though most magic users didn't realize it. When wizards cast spells, they were essentially borrowing elemental power. Ice magic pulled from the ice elemental's domain, fire magic from fire's domain, and so on. The elements provided the fundamental forces that magic shaped into specific effects. Understanding this didn't make magic more predictable. Elements were powerful enough that borrowing their power came with inherent chaos, but it explained why certain spell types clustered together and why elemental magic was more stable than purely creative magic. Reality in Oo operated on elemental principles whether anyone acknowledged it or not. The seasons followed elemental cycles. The ecosystems balanced creation and destruction. Change and preservation fought constant subtle battles that kept Oo dynamic without collapsing into chaos or stasis. The Mushroom War had disrupted this balance, allowing magic to flood back in, but the elemental structure remained underneath everything. Oo wasn't random weirdness. It was structured weirdness, patterns within chaos, cosmic principles expressing themselves through talking dogs and candy kingdoms. Princess Bubblegum's awareness of her elemental nature changed how she understood her own history. The Mother Gum wasn't just radioactive sludge that gained consciousness. It was the candy elemental finding form in a world that had space for it. Her drive to create candy people wasn't just personal loneliness. It was elemental imperative to generate life and complexity. Her need to control the Candy Kingdom wasn't just personality quirk. It was Candy's principle of careful creation and protection, expressing itself through governance. She was still responsible for her choices, but understanding their cosmic context added weight to decisions that already felt impossible. The question of whether Princess Bubblegum could be killed gained elemental complexity. Kill her body, sure, but the Candy Elemental would just reincarnate in a new form. The element persisted even when the individual didn't, which was either reassuring, her principles would continue, or terrifying. She was replaceable to the universe even if irreplaceable to her people. Immortality through reincarnation was cold comfort when you liked being this specific person, rather than the next iteration of cosmic candy force. Flame Princess struggled with similar questions after learning her cosmic role. Was her difficulty controlling fire just adolescent power issues, or was she fighting against the fire elemental's desire to burn everything? When she chose restraint, was that personal growth or was she suppressing her elemental nature? Could she be a good person while embodying destruction? The elements didn't come with instruction manuals, just power and vague cosmic purpose that each elemental had to interpret independently. The balance between elements was dynamic rather than static. They weren't supposed to exist in perfect equilibrium. That would produce stasis, which was Ice's domain alone. Instead, they were supposed to cycle through dominance, each element getting its turn to shape reality before yielding to the next. The problem came when one element tried to dominate permanently, or when elementals refused to participate in the cycle. Patience wanted permanent elemental zones. The current elementals wanted to be people first and cosmic forces second. The tension between cosmic duty and personal choice defined their entire existence. Oo's weirdness made more sense through an elemental lens. The constant mixing of impossible things, candy people talking to fire people who negotiated with ice constructs, while slime creatures provided lubrication for social interaction, was elements forced into proximity. The Mushroom War had broken geographical boundaries, making elemental interaction constant rather than cyclical. This shouldn't have worked. By elemental logic, constant mixing should produce either synthesis or catastrophe. Instead, it produced ooh, where nothing made sense but everything somehow functioned. Maybe that was the point. Maybe this cycle's lesson was that elements could coexist if the people embodying them chose cooperation over cosmic imperative. The existential weight of being cosmically significant while also being 17 and trying to figure out relationships was its own special torture. Flame Princess had to navigate being a teenager and being the fire elemental simultaneously. Those roles conflicted constantly. Teenagers need rebellion and mistakes and growth. Elementals need stability and cosmic responsibility, and maintaining universal balance. Trying to do both meant failing at both, or succeeding at both, but never feeling like either role got proper attention. Being a cosmic force didn't pause adolescence. You just got to be confused about your identity on multiple levels simultaneously. Magic Man and Margle's connection to Golb added another layer to Oo's cosmic structure, but that's the next section's territory. What mattered for understanding elementals was recognizing that they existed within a larger cosmological framework. Elements maintained reality's structure. Golb threatened to unmake that structure. The relationship was oppositional but necessary. Creation needs destruction as a boundary, something to push against. Without Golb, the elements might create forever until reality collapsed under its own complexity. Without elements, Golb would dissolve everything into chaos. The balance was universal, not just Ooh specific. So when did Ooh stop being random and start being cosmically structured? Was it always structured, with the structure only becoming visible once people understood what they were looking at? Or did consciousness shape the cosmic patterns, creating elemental roles because belief made them necessary? Princess Bubblegum probably had theories. 17 theories, all contradictory, each supported by different evidence. The answer likely involved both. Reality was structured and random simultaneously. Elements were fundamental and constructed. Ooh operated on cosmic principles that were also just weird accidents elevated to significance by beings desperate for meaning. Here's the thing about discovering you're part of a cosmic cycle. It changes nothing about who you are while changing everything about what you mean. Princess Bubblegum was still Princess Bubblegum. Flame Princess was still Flame Princess. But now they knew their choices rippled cosmically, that their nature wasn't just personal but universal, and that maintaining themselves meant maintaining reality's structure. No pressure, just run your kingdom, manage your relationships, grow as a person, and also keep reality from collapsing into elemental chaos. Standard teenage superhero stuff, really, except the superhero powers were fundamental forces of nature, and the stakes were literally everything. The elementals continued existing, continued choosing, continued trying to balance cosmic duty with personal desire. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed spectacularly, but they kept trying because that's what consciousness does. It tries. Even when trying is cosmically significant, even when failure means reality reshapes itself, even when success just means delaying the next crisis. The elements would cycle forever, incarnation after incarnation, each one facing similar struggles and making different choices about how to be both person and principle. And somewhere in the Candy Kingdom, Princess Bubblegum was probably already developing technology to detect elemental imbalances before they became catastrophic, because if you're going to be a cosmic force, you might as well be a prepared cosmic force with good documentation and backup plans. That's just good science, and also good candy-based reality maintenance. Same thing really when you're the candy elemental. There are two types of existential threats in OO. The first wants to kill you, the second wants to unmake the concept of you ever having existed in the first place. Neither is particularly fun at parties, but at least the first one you can understand. Death makes sense. Every living thing dies eventually. It's sad, it's inevitable, but it follows logic that consciousness can process. The second threat, the unmaking, the dissolution, the return to primordial chaos, that's the kind of threat that breaks minds just by being comprehended. And being OO has both threats fully operational and occasionally intersecting in ways that suggest the universe has a dark sense of humour about cosmic horror. The Lich was born in fire, specifically the nuclear fire of the Mushroom War, that brief moment when humanity reached peak destructive capability and decided to test it on itself. In the space where a bomb detonated, where matter converted to energy, and that energy tore reality apart, something else emerged. Not created exactly, more like revealed. Death had always existed as concept, as natural process, as the thing that happens when life stops happening. But the Mushroom War gave death consciousness, purpose, form. The Lich was death incarnate, extinction wearing a skeleton like a particularly disturbing Halloween costume, and his singular purpose was simple: end all life in the universe. Not through malice. That's the terrifying part. The Lich didn't hate life or seek revenge or want to rule over ashes. He just wanted life to stop happening, the way you might want a dripping faucet to stop dripping. Life was incorrect to him, an error in the universe's code. His existence was devoted to debugging reality by removing the problematic variable of consciousness, experience, and everything that made existence worth existing. He was the ultimate evil not because he chose evil, but because his nature was antithetical to being itself. Fighting the Lich wasn't like fighting a villain with bad motivations. It was like fighting entropy, or gravity, or the heat death of the universe. You don't win, you just postpone. Billy understood this, which was probably what destroyed him psychologically. He'd fought the Lich when it first manifested fully, back when Billy was still convinced heroism mattered, and that defeating evil was achievable rather than cyclical. The battle was legendary. Billy versus Extinction Incarnate, raw heroic determination against the void that wanted everything to end. Billy won, technically. He trapped the Lich in amber, sealed the prison in the Candy Kingdom sublevels, and established enough magical barriers that the Lich would stay imprisoned for centuries. Minimum. Probably longer. Definitely long enough that Billy could claim victory and be celebrated as the hero who defeated ultimate evil. Except Billy knew better. The Lich wasn't defeated. It was contained. And containers break eventually. Seals fail. Magic weakens. Given enough time, and the Lich had infinite time because death doesn't experience duration the way living things do, it would escape, and then someone else would have to fight it, and maybe they'd win. And maybe they'd imprison it again, and then it would escape again, forever, because you can't actually kill death. You just keep fighting the same battle across generations while pretending progress is happening. Billy saw the pattern. He understood that his greatest victory was meaningless in the long term, and that understanding crushed him slowly over centuries until he retired to a crack in a canyon to contemplate futility. The Lich's prison was both the Candy Kingdom's greatest security asset and its most terrifying liability. Princess Bubblegum knew it was down there. She monitored the seals constantly, reinforced the magic periodically, and absolutely did not mention to her candy citizens that Extinction Incarnate was imprisoned under their homes. No point in causing panic when the seals were holding fine. Probably fine. Definitely, maybe fine. She had contingency plans if it escaped, evacuation protocols, weapon systems, magical countermeasures, but her real security was hoping Finn and Jake would somehow handle it if containment failed. Which was either brilliant strategic thinking or unconscionable burden shifting to teenagers, probably both. When the Lich did escape, because of course it escaped, containers always break eventually. Finn faced the thing that had broken Billy. 13 years old, optimistic, convinced that heroism meant fighting bad guys until they stopped being bad. The Lich was his introduction to the concept that some bad guys can't be stopped permanently, that some fights you don't win so much as survive, and that the universe contains threats beyond any individual's capacity to permanently solve. Finn fought the Lich multiple times across his adolescence. He won some rounds through clever tactics or magical assistance. He lost others spectacularly. He learned that the Lich always came back, always found new forms, always continued pursuing universal extinction with the patience of something that didn't experience frustration or disappointment. The Lich possessed people, turned them into vessels for death's purpose, while their consciousness screamed in the background. Sweet Pea, the Lich reincarnated as a gentle giant child, represented one of the few times someone tried solving the problem through transformation rather than imprisonment. Turn extinction into innocence. Give death a childhood and hope that nurture could override cosmic nature. It worked, mostly, though the Lich's essence remained underneath Sweet Pea's gentle exterior, waiting for trauma or stress to crack the seal and let extinction peek through. Sweet Pea lived with the knowledge that he contained something terrible, that he was both himself and the thing that wanted to end everything, which was its own special psychological torture that therapy anew probably wasn't equipped to handle. But let's talk about Golb, because the Lich was just death. Terrifying, inevitable, but comprehensible. Golb was something older and stranger. Chaos incarnate, unmaking itself, the force that existed before reality and would exist after reality decided to stop existing. Golb wasn't part of the elemental system. Golb was what the elemental system protected against, the outside threat that elements organized to resist. Where elements created structure, Golb dissolved it. Where consciousness made meaning, Golb returned it to meaninglessness. Golb was the void beyond the void, the chaos that preceded existence and would eventually reclaim it. Magic Man knew about Golb intimately, which explained why he was so profoundly damaged. His story was tragic in ways that made Ice King's curse look merciful by comparison. Magic Man, Margle's husband, once normal, once happy, had watched Golb consume his wife, not kill her, unmake her, erase her from existence so completely that even memories became suspect. Did Margles exist? Was she real? Magic Man remembered her, but memory of the unmade might itself be false, retroactive impossibility generated by a mind trying to make sense of loss that shouldn't be possible to experience. He went insane from the encounter, not because insanity was a rational response, but because insanity was the only rational response to comprehending Golb's nature. The transformation into normal man happened when Magic Man transferred his insanity to someone else, specifically a random bug, and suddenly experienced clarity for the first time in eons. The clarity revealed that he'd spent centuries being a chaos goblin, spreading misery through pranks that were actually expressions of cosmic trauma. Normal man tried being better, tried using his clarity for good, but the weight of understanding what he'd lost to Golb never left. He'd touched the unmaking and survived, but survival meant living with the knowledge that existence was temporary and consciousness was fragile, and nothing actually mattered against the eventual dissolution that Golb represented. Betty's sacrifice brought everything full circle in the most Adventure Time way possible. Tragic, necessary, absurd, and somehow hopeful despite the cosmic horror. Betty had spent years trying to save Simon from the Ice Crown's curse, pursuing magical solutions across dimensions and timelines, refusing to accept that some transformations can't be reversed. When she finally encountered Golb during its attack on Oo, because of course Golb attacked Oo, chaos eventually finds everything, she made the ultimate choice. Merge with Golb, become its keeper, its consciousness, the thing that guided unmaking rather than letting it operate autonomously. She saved Simon by sacrificing herself to cosmic chaos, becoming something beyond human or deity, forever bound to the force that unmade reality. Simon got his sanity back. The crown's curse lifted. He remembered Betty, remembered everything, and had to live with the knowledge that the woman he loved had merged with chaos itself to save him. She was gone, but also everywhere. Unmade, but also eternal. Lost, but also transformed into something that couldn't be lost, because it existed outside the categories that made loss meaningful. He couldn't even properly grieve, because grieving required absence, and Betty wasn't absent. She was Golb, which was somehow worse than death, because at least death was final. Golb's attack on Oo revealed why the land's weirdness was actually protective. Oo was already chaotic, already mixed, already defying rigid categories and logic. Golb's unmaking worked best against ordered systems, stable kingdoms, predictable magic, reality operating according to consistent rules. But Oo was none of those things. Oo was fluid, contradictory, impossible. When Golb tried to unmake the Candy Kingdom, it found a kingdom made of sentient candy ruled by a scientific dictator who created life in her basement. When it tried to unmake the Ice Kingdom, it found a cursed wizard who'd already been partially unmade by magic for 1,000 years. When it tried to unmake Finn and Jake, it found a human raised by dogs and a magical dog-alien hybrid. Nothing in Oo made sense, which meant Golb's unmaking couldn't find stable patterns to dissolve. The singing was perhaps the weirdest defense against cosmic chaos, which tracks for Adventure Time. BMO sang, others joined. The song spread through Oo, creating harmony from chaos, meaning from nonsense. Golb couldn't unmake music because music was already structured chaos. Patterns that acknowledged disorder, while imposing temporary meaning on it. The singing didn't defeat Golb. Nothing defeats Golb. But it slowed the unmaking long enough for Betty to make her choice, to merge with chaos and guide it away from Oo. The universe was saved by singing badly but enthusiastically, which was either profound philosophical commentary about consciousness creating meaning in meaningless void, or just Adventure Time being Adventure Time. Probably both. The relationship between the Lich and Golb was complementary and terrifying. The Lich wanted to end life, to achieve universal extinction through death. Golb wanted to unmake existence itself, to return everything to primordial chaos where even death was meaningless category. If the Lich succeeded, Golb would still have a universe to unmake. Dead, but existing. If Golb succeeded, the Lich would cease to exist along with everything else. They were threats on different scales. The Lich was apocalyptic, Golb was existential. But both represented the ultimate question that consciousness faces. What do you do when confronted with forces that make your existence meaningless? Finn's answer was keep fighting. Not because fighting would permanently solve anything, not because heroism would defeat extinction or chaos, but because fighting was itself meaningful, a choice to assert value in a universe that might not have inherent value. The Lich would keep returning. Golb would eventually reclaim everything. But today Finn could help people. Today he could protect his friends. Today he could choose good over evil, even when good was temporary and evil was eternal. The heroism wasn't in winning forever. It was in choosing to fight today despite knowing tomorrow would bring new fights. Princess Bubblegum's answer was preparation and control. She couldn't stop the Lich or Golb, but she could monitor threats, develop countermeasures, establish protocols. She built her kingdom with redundancies and fail-safes because if catastrophe was inevitable, you could at least minimize the damage. Her approach was rational, scientific, pragmatic. It was also exhausting and paranoid and required constant vigilance that wore down immortals over centuries, but it worked. The Candy Kingdom survived threats that destroyed other kingdoms because Princess Bubblegum treated every day like extinction might arrive tomorrow. Jake's answer was live fully while you can. Death comes for everyone. Chaos unmakes everything, but right now there's pizza and video games and adventures with your best friend. Appreciate the moment. Love the people around you. Don't waste existence worrying about inevitable doom when you could be enjoying the weird, beautiful, brief consciousness you get to experience. Jake's philosophy seemed shallow compared to Finn's heroism or Princess Bubblegum's preparation, but it was actually deeply wise. Accept impermanence, embrace joy, and don't let fear of endings prevent you from having beginnings. Marceline's answer was witness and remember. She'd outlived most things she loved. She'd watched civilizations rise and fall. She knew nothing lasted, but she kept existing, kept making music, kept forming connections, even when those connections would eventually end. Her immortality wasn't blessing, it was burden, but she carried it by choosing to experience and document and remember. When everything ended, when the Lich won, or Golb unmade everything, at least someone would have noticed it mattered. At least someone would have sung songs about the things that existed before they stopped existing. The cosmic horror of Ooh wasn't just that threats existed, it was that the threats were fundamentally insurmountable. You couldn't kill death. You couldn't order chaos. The best you could do was postpone, contain, redirect, or merge with them, and hope that guided annihilation was better than autonomous annihilation. The universe had an expiration date. Consciousness was temporary. Everything Finn fought for would eventually end. Every kingdom Princess Bubblegum built would fall. Every song Marceline sang would fade into silence. The heat death of the universe, or the Lich's extinction, or Golb's unmaking. Something would eventually win, but not today. Today Ooh still existed. Today people still loved and fought and built and sang. Today the weird, wonderful, impossible land of magic and talking dogs and candy kingdoms was alive and chaotic and beautiful. Tomorrow might bring doom. Next century might bring extinction. Eventually chaos would reclaim everything. But the fact that existence was temporary didn't make it meaningless. It made it precious, worth protecting, worth fighting for even when fighting was futile. The Lich would return. Golb would continue unmaking things at the edges of reality. Sweet Pea would struggle with the monster inside him. Betty would guide chaos while Simon grieved her transformation. These were permanent conditions of existence in Ooh, threats that couldn't be eliminated, only managed, and everyone who understood this, Billy, Finn, Princess Bubblegum, Marceline, had to decide how to live with that knowledge without it crushing them. Some chose heroism, some chose preparation, some chose living fully, some chose witnessing. All of them were valid responses to the impossible situation of being conscious in a universe that would eventually eliminate consciousness. All of them required courage. Not the courage to fight once and win, but the courage to keep choosing meaning when meaning was temporary and doom was patient. Golb waited beyond reality's edges. The Lich waited in whatever prison currently held it. Both threats were eternal, patient, inevitable, and Ooh continued existing between them. A bubble of chaos that made sense surrounded by forces that wanted to either end or unmake it. The fact that Ooh survived wasn't miracle. It was just Ooh being Ooh, weird, resilient, determined to keep being impossible for as long as impossible lasted, which might be forever, or might be tomorrow. Either way, today was worth fighting for. That's the real answer to cosmic horror. Not defeating it. You can't. But choosing to exist vibrantly, fully, courageously in the space between threats, making that space matter through love and heroism and music and science, and all the other ways consciousness asserts meaning against the void. The Lich wanted everyone dead. Golb wanted everyone unmade, and Ooh just kept being alive and made, stubbornly, gloriously, impossibly. Sometimes the best response to existential horror is just continuing to exist, making it as weird as possible, and singing badly while you do it. BMO sits in front of a campfire telling stories to two young adventurers who weren't born yet when Finn and Jake had their last adventure. The fire crackles. The stars overhead are different than they were a millennium ago, not because the stars moved, but because Ooh moved, reality shifted, and even the sky agreed to participate in the cosmic weird that defines this land. BMO's voice is the same as always, cheerful and slightly robotic, narrating events that happened so long ago they've become mythology. This is how legacies work in U. You have adventures, you change the world, you die or transform or fade, and then centuries later, a sentient video game console tells strangers about that time you fought a demon and saved everyone. Immortality through storytelling, which is the best kind because at least the stories are entertaining. Shermy and Beth listen with the kind of attention that young adventurers give to tales about legendary heroes. Shermy is possibly human, the details are vague, but he's got the right general shape and the kind of enthusiasm that suggests humanity's capacity for heroic stupidity survived another 1,000 years. Beth is a shape-shifting creature, maybe Jake's descendant from some distant branch of the family tree, carrying that same casual attitude about physics that made Jake excellent at improvising solutions to impossible problems. They're the new generation, the next cycle, proof that U continues producing heroes even after the legendary ones are gone. 1,000 years is long enough for everything to change and nothing to change simultaneously. The kingdom still exists, sort of. The Candy Kingdom stands but looks different. Architecture evolved, population shifted. Princess Bubblegum might still be ruling, or might have finally stepped down, or might have transformed into something else entirely. The show doesn't give clear answers about her fate, which is probably intentional. Some characters deserve ambiguous endings that let audiences imagine their own conclusions. Maybe she's still there, eternal scientist ruler maintaining her kingdom through technological evolution. Maybe she finally let go, passed leadership to someone else, and retired to pursue research without the burden of governance. Maybe she and Marceline found some weird immortal happiness together, a relationship that survived literal millennia of complications and finally achieved stability. Marceline's fate is similarly unclear, which fits for someone who spent 1,000 years watching everything change around her. She might still be wandering playing bass guitar and writing songs about the friends she's outlived. She might have found peace or transcendence or whatever vampires find when they've existed long enough that existence stops feeling urgent. She might be with Princess Bubblegum, might be alone, might have transformed into something beyond vampire categories. The ambiguity is appropriate for someone whose entire arc was about learning to form connections, despite knowing those connections were temporary. Her legacy isn't a kingdom or a great achievement. It's the music, the relationships, the proof that you can survive everything and still choose to care about things. Finn and Jake's endings are the most discussed and debated. The finale hints at transformation rather than simple death. Finn and Jake. Together again shows them reuniting in the afterlife, or a post-life state, where Jake had died earlier and Finn lived to old age before joining him. They get to continue existing in some form, having adventures in a dead world before eventually reincarnating or ascending or whatever comes next in the cosmic cycle. It's both comforting and bittersweet. They're together, which was always the most important thing. But they're also gone from U proper. Their physical existence ended while their spiritual or reincarnated existence continues elsewhere. The idea that Finn lived to old age means he got what heroes rarely get, a full life. He wasn't cut down in his prime fighting some cosmic threat. He grew up, grew old, presumably had experiences and relationships and adventures that the show didn't document, because documenting everything would miss the point. Finn's story wasn't about being the eternal hero. It was about being a good person who made heroic choices, lived fully, and eventually passed on having made U slightly better than he found it. That's success. Not defeating ultimate evil forever, that's impossible, but improving things marginally and living a life worth living while doing it. Jake's earlier death is consistent with his character. He was older than Finn, he had a family, he lived hard and loved fully and probably didn't spend his final years worrying about what came next. Jake faced death the way he faced everything, with casual acceptance and the assumption that whatever happened would probably be fine. His legacy was his kids, dozens of puppies from multiple litters with Lady Rainicorn, each carrying pieces of his shape-shifting alien heritage. The puppies grew up, had their own adventures, passed on the genetics and the philosophy. Jake's immortality was biological and mimetic, genes continuing through descendants, stories continuing through retelling. BMO survived everything, which makes sense for a character who was already ancient technology before Finn and Jake found them. BMO witnessed the Mushroom War era, survived the centuries between Apocalypse and Kingdom era, befriended Finn and Jake, and continued existing long after everyone else was gone. BMO's survival wasn't just physical durability, it was emotional durability. The ability to form deep attachments to people, lose those people, grieve, and then form new attachments without becoming cynical or closed off. BMO loved Finn and Jake. Now BMO loves Shermy and Beth. The capacity for continuous love despite continuous loss is BMO's superpower, more impressive than any magic or technology. The ruins scattered across Future tell stories about what happened in the intervening centuries. Some recognisable landmarks remain. The tree fort is still there in some form, a monument or museum, or maybe still occupied by whoever inherited it. The Candy Kingdom's walls stand, though whether they protect the same kingdom or something new is unclear. Ice King's mountain looks abandoned, which makes sense if Simon finally achieved peace or transformation or death after spending a millennium as a cursed wizard. The architecture suggests civilizations rose and fell, kingdoms expanded and contracted, the usual churn of history playing out while the land itself remained fundamentally ooh. New kingdoms emerge to replace old ones or exist alongside them. The future has its own politics, its own conflicts, its own weird diplomatic situations where sentient breakfast foods negotiate with crystalline entities about territorial disputes. Ooh's fundamental nature, chaotic, magical, impossible, persisted through the centuries. The specific kingdoms and rulers changed, but the underlying pattern of weird civilizations doing weird civilization things remained constant. It's the same Ooh, just wearing different clothes and populated by different characters acting out similar dramas. Magic evolved or stayed the same depending on how you measure it. The fundamental forces remained: elements, cosmic cycles, reality's flexibility about physics. But the specific expressions changed. New wizards developed new spells. New artifacts became legendary while old artifacts were forgotten or lost. The Enchiridion might still exist as a historical document, or might have been destroyed or lost or transformed into digital format by BMO. Magic's presence in Ooh was permanent, but its specific manifestations cycled through iterations the way everything cycles, in a land where time is weird and permanence is negotiable. Shermy and Beth represent hope that the heroic tradition continues. They're not Finn and Jake reincarnated, or maybe they are, the show is deliberately vague, but they carry forward the same spirit. Young adventurers seeking dungeons and helping people and exploring a world that remains dangerous and wonderful. They have BMO as a guide, access to stories about legendary heroes, and the same fundamental optimism that made Finn think heroism mattered, despite all evidence that evil was eternal. Each generation gets to rediscover that heroism is valuable not because it permanently solves problems, but because choosing to help others is intrinsically worthwhile. The thematic message of the future being similar to the past is either depressing or comforting depending on your perspective. Nothing Finn did permanently fixed. Ooh, the lich will return or something like it will emerge. Kingdoms will still have conflicts. People will still need saving, but that's not failure, that's existence. The point wasn't to solve everything forever. The point was to make things better temporarily, to help the people in front of you, to live a good life and inspire others to do the same. The cycle continues not because heroism failed, but because existence itself is cyclical, and the goal is participating meaningfully rather than achieving permanent resolution. Princess Bubblegum's scientific legacy probably persisted whether or not she did. The technology she developed, the candy biology she perfected, the governance structures she established, those would influence future kingdoms, even if the Candy Kingdom itself changed. Her impact wasn't just personal, but systemic, the way great thinkers shape civilization's trajectory, even after they're gone. Future rulers might reject her authoritarian tendencies while adopting her scientific methods. Future scientists might build on her research while acknowledging her ethical failures. Legacy is complicated. You can't control how future generations interpret your work, only that you did work worth interpreting. Marceline's music definitely survived. Songs travel through time more reliably than kingdoms. Someone 1,000 years later still plays Everything Stays because the melody is beautiful and the lyrics are universal. Marceline's records, her journals, her bass guitar. These became artifacts that future generations studied and preserved. She documented her existence in ways that ensured she'd be remembered not just as the vampire queen, but as an artist who turned pain into beauty and loneliness into connection. That's the kind of immortality that matters, not living forever, but creating things that resonate across centuries because they captured something true about existence. Ice King, Simon, deserves mention in any discussion of Oo's future because his story was about finally finding peace after a millennium of suffering. If Simon died, it was hopefully as himself rather than as the cursed wizard. If he survived, it was hopefully with his sanity intact and maybe some companionship that made continued existence worthwhile. The crown's curse defined so much of Oo's history. The apocalypse survivor who saved Marceline, the tragic wizard who couldn't remember why he kidnapped princesses, the man who loved Betty so much that her sacrifice to gold broke him all over again. His ending, whatever it was, hopefully involved peace or at least cessation of suffering. The elemental cycle continued because cosmic forces don't stop cycling just because individual incarnations end. There would be new elementals, new candy, new fire, new ice, new slime, each facing similar struggles about balancing cosmic duty with personal identity. The patterns repeated, but the people changed, meaning each cycle got to explore the same questions from new perspectives. Future Princess Bubblegum would face different challenges than past Princess Bubblegum, but the fundamental tension between creation and control would remain. That's how cosmic cycles work. Eternal recurrence with variation, same themes in different keys. The Lich's ultimate fate is unknown, which is appropriate for a threat that represents death itself. Maybe Sweet Pea grew up successfully containing the Lich's essence, proving that nurture could overcome nature if you tried hard enough and got lucky. Maybe the Lich eventually broke free and had to be imprisoned again by future heroes. Maybe extinction finally achieved its goal, and all life ended, but then life emerged again because existence is stubborn, and death isn't the final word even when death wants to be. The ambiguity reflects reality. Evil isn't defeated permanently, but it also doesn't win permanently. The struggle continues across generations with no final victor, just temporary victories and ongoing resistance. Golb remained beyond reality, presumably still guided by Betty in whatever form she'd become. The chaos at the edges of existence didn't go away because chaos is fundamental. But guided chaos, chaos with intention, unmaking that recognized what shouldn't be unmade, was better than autonomous chaos. Betty's sacrifice saved Oo not by eliminating the threat, but by transforming it into something manageable. That's the best victory available against cosmic forces. Not elimination, but negotiation, redirection, finding ways to coexist with threats you can't destroy. Adventure Time's final message through its future set ending was about impermanence and continuity. Everything ends. Finn died, Jake died, the kingdoms changed. The specific characters and conflicts that defined the show's present became historical facts. But the spirit continued. New heroes emerged, new adventures happened. The land itself remained alive and weird and full of possibilities. Endings aren't failures, they're transitions. The story continues even after the main character's exit, which is beautiful and sad and ultimately hopeful, because it means the good you do ripples forward beyond your own existence. The show taught that everything stays, but it still changes. Marceline's song title became thesis statement. The core remains while the surface transforms. Ooh stayed, ooh, magical, chaotic, dangerous, wonderful, but the specific expression of oohness evolved. The tree fort stayed but changed. The kingdom stayed but changed. The heroic tradition stayed but changed. Nothing was permanent except the pattern of change itself, and accepting that pattern rather than resisting it was wisdom. What does it mean to leave a legacy in a world where everything eventually fades? Finn and Jake became stories that BMO told around campfires. Their specific actions were remembered imperfectly. Details shifted, events merged, the truth became mythology. But the spirit was preserved. Future heroes knew that once upon a time, a boy and his dog had adventures and helped people and proved that heroism mattered. The specifics weren't important. The inspiration was. Legacy isn't about accurate historical record. It's about giving future generations reasons to try, to hope, to believe that their choices matter even when permanence is impossible. BMO's role as storyteller was perfect for a character who'd always existed between categories. Not quite person, not quite object, not quite alive, not quite machine. BMO witnessed history and transformed it into narrative, giving future generations access to the past through stories that were true emotionally if not factually. BMO was Oo's memory, its historian, its connection between eras, and BMO did it with the same cheerful enthusiasm that characterized all their actions. Being the last survivor of your era is lonely, but BMO transformed loneliness into purpose, remembering so others could learn, loving so others could feel loved, continuing so the story could continue. Shermy and Beth facing their own adventures meant the cycle wasn't just repetition, it was renewal. They weren't trying to be Finn and Jake. They were being themselves, having their own experiences, facing their own challenges. But they carried forward the tradition, the understanding that Ooh needed heroes and that being a hero meant helping people despite knowing your help was temporary. Each generation got to rediscover these truths personally rather than accepting them abstractly. That's how wisdom transmits, not through lecture, but through lived experience that resonates with inherited stories. The far future of Ooh, beyond even Shermy and Beth, into realms of speculation that the show barely touched, would probably continue the pattern. More heroes, more kingdoms, more cosmic threats and weird solutions. The Mushroom War would become ancient history, then myth, then forgotten entirely except by scholars who studied dead civilizations. But the world it created would persist, transforming continually while maintaining its essential character. Ooh would remain Ooh, magical, impossible, alive, as long as consciousness existed to experience it. So here's what Adventure Time taught us through its exploration of time, history, and legacy. The apocalypse happened, civilization fell, humanity nearly went extinct. But from the ashes came something weird and beautiful. A land where candy could think, where dogs could talk, where ice wizards kidnapped princesses and boys with magic dogs could have adventures that mattered. The tragedy of the Mushroom War didn't erase the possibility of joy, beauty, or meaning. It just transformed the context in which those things occurred. Finn's heroism mattered not because it solved everything, but because it improved specific situations for specific people. Princess Bubblegum's kingdom mattered not because it was perfect, but because it provided safety and purpose for beings she'd created. Marceline's music mattered not because it changed the world, but because it expressed truths about loneliness and connection that resonated across centuries. Jake's friendship mattered not because it was profound, but because it was genuine and made Finn's life better. BMO's survival mattered not because BMO achieved greatness, but because BMO loved people and remembered their stories. The lesson wasn't that heroism defeats evil permanently. It was that heroism creates moments of goodness in an imperfect world, and those moments are valuable even when temporary. The lesson wasn't that building kingdoms ensures eternal stability. It was that creating community and protecting the vulnerable matters, even when communities eventually change or end. The lesson wasn't that existence has inherent meaning. It was that consciousness creates meaning through choices, relationships, and actions, and that created meaning is real even when not eternal. Ooh existed because the old world died catastrophically. Ooh thrived because the new inhabitants chose to build, create, love, and fight for good things despite knowing those things were fragile. Ooh continued because each generation rediscovered that participating in existence, messy, chaotic, temporary existence, was better than surrendering to despair or nihilism. The world ended once. It could end again. But between endings, there was life and magic and adventure, and that was enough. 1,000 years after Finn and Jake's final adventure, BMO finished the story. Shermy and Beth sat by the dying fire, processing what they'd heard. The legendary heroes were gone, but heroism remained. Adventures waited. Ooh continued spinning through the cosmos, weird and wonderful and impermanent, exactly as it should be. Tomorrow they'd explore a dungeon, or help someone in trouble, or discover something impossible that would become their own story to tell around future campfires. Everything ends. Everything continues. That's the real adventure. So what was your favourite era of... The before times when humans ran everything. The apocalypse when reality broke and magic returned. the early kingdoms when civilizations emerged from chaos, or the hero era when Finn proved that optimism could survive contact with cosmic horror. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which kingdom you'd want to live in. Share your theories about what happened to Princess Bubblegum and Marceline. Argue about whether the Lich could ever truly be defeated or if extinction always wins eventually. Because Adventure Time taught us that the conversation continues after the story ends. That legacy lives through discussion, interpretation, and the impact stories have on people who experience them. The show ended. Ooh continues in our imagination, and somewhere in that space between fiction and meaning, between entertainment and philosophy, the real magic happens. Thanks for joining this journey through every major era of Ooh. From nuclear fire to candy kingdoms, from cursed wizards to heroic humans, from extinction threats to vampire songs, it's been mathematical. Now go have your own adventures, whatever form those adventures take in your particular reality. And remember, everything stays, but it still changes. That's not just a lyric. That's the truth about existence itself, mathematical.